Yo, what's up guys, hope you guys are doing good. So today we are going to see what if Naruto was son of dragon and got harem part 2. Hope you will enjoy this video, so before we start please like the video and subscribe to our channel and hit bell notification, it motivates me to upload more fanfics for my lovely audience. So let's get started. The leave that the final handful of soldiers that made up the 13th had enjoyed was entirely too short. Naruto himself felt the typical exhausted feeling he had come to accept as normal, return full force as he and the last 15 of his subordinates reunited in what would be their barracks over the next few months of training. The young captain felt a mix of pride and heartache looking at his surviving soldiers. They were so few in number, but he was confident in each one of them being some of the hardiest and most loyal men and women in the army. He just wished more of his unit had survived. Captain. The unit is assembled. The now Lieutenant Mulan sounded off with a smart salute. Thank you, Lieutenant. At ease everyone. We'll need all the proper stuff later, but right now it's just us. Naruto said and smiled faintly as he watched the force before him relax. I just recently came from a meeting with the Fire Lord himself. He applauds our unit's heroics, and Naruto hesitated just enough so the men knew the truth. He mourns our losses. However, the Fire Lord in his grand wisdom has decided to disband the 13th Jaguar Company. Naruto dropped the bomb on his troops, causing their eyes to widen in shock and handful quite literally gasp. Thankfully, I was given the option to choose my officers and non-commissioned officers for the new unit I will be building here at Kazkan Base. You aren't getting rid of me that easily, he said with a chuckle, getting relieved looks and a few grins in return. I won't beat around the bush. This unit we will be building will be special. Most of you are aware of the ideal our great nation strives for. A new balance for our world. One that strengthens not only our people but the entirety of our species and brings it into a new golden age. We fight to end oppressive regimes and ideologies that have held sway over the majority of the world since the dawn of time, and this unit will be the first big step in showing that progress. Naruto passionately explained, dragging his listeners along with him as he spoke. Over the course of this century-long conflict, our own nation has committed deeds considered vile and terrible, but we have also done things to help the people of the world more than any other nation before us. This is what we have all been fighting for, I promise you. It also means that soon this war will end and a new age will be ushered in with us at the forefront. Naruto continued. Still the soldiers were confused. What exactly was the plan here? We have been instructed directly from the Fire Lord himself to construct the first mixed unit in the Fire Nation military. Over the years, defectors or conquered citizens have been assimilated into our great nation, turning their backs on their former backward societies. Starting today we will constitute the leadership of the new first mixed company of the Fire Nation Army. We will be joined by not only fire benders but also water benders and earth benders that have called the Fire Nation home and sworn themselves to their fatherland's success and prosperity. The troops shifted slightly, but at their captain's words they nodded along and accepted that despite using the bending of their enemies, these new soldiers would be comrades. The next year will be difficult for us. Training and organizing this unit will be an incredible challenge. There is simply too much bad blood between the nations for it not to spill over into issues within this force. However, I have faith in all of you to do your duty and guide our soldiers into the future that we have all been fighting for so long. Naruto concluded his little briefing speech before handing things over to Mulan. The young woman quickly gave a more detailed rundown on what to expect in the coming days. They were going to be getting an entirely green force of recruits, some from the Boiling River Province, a region of the homeland set aside for defected Water Tribe members, mostly descended from those once captured by the raids on the Southern Water Tribe. The few Earth Benders joining them all came from the colonies and had been far less forcefully integrated into the Fire Nation than the Water Tribe members. Some even came from mixed Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation families, a growing trend among the colonial cities and provinces. Naruto watched as his officers got serious and worked diligently to familiarize themselves with the training program and organization this new experimental unit would possess. They memorized the more notable recruits and prepared themselves mentally for the challenge of training soldiers for the war they had experienced so far. Naruto hoped that it would be enough. He also prayed that he would be capable of training and leading this force back into the hellish reality of the 100-Year War. From the raised platform overlooking the drill yard of Kazkan Base, Naruto and Mulan watched as their subordinate officers barked out at the new recruits before them. Nearly 200 fresh faces. All of them older than himself but far younger than most of his officers. They are really green, he murmured to Mulan quietly so only she could hear. We have a whole year to whip them into shape. She replied simply. Agni guide me. I hope that it's enough. Naruto groaned as he saw several of the recruits have to be physically put into place by their unit leaders. Was I ever that undisciplined? Naruto wondered aloud. I would label you a lot of things but discipline isn't all that high up on the list. Mulan said with a smirk. Her words were baseless, and just a joke. Naruto held himself to a rigid standard, though in this case she meant more his respect for the normal methodology a soldier and officer followed. Looks like they are finishing up. Best to get things on the road. Mulan said to him as Naruto stepped forward to the podium. The audience of troopers slowly silenced themselves as their commander made it clear he intended to speak to them. Naruto had led soldiers already, he was a natural at it, but there was something that unnerved him about so many fresh recruits staring up at him in rapt attention. The blonde cleared his throat for a moment before speaking to his assembled soldiers. Some of you have received only the most basic of training prior to being reassigned here. All of you have been in the army for less than a year. Every single one of you has been specifically chosen due to your testing scores and backgrounds for this unit. None of that matters right now. Right now you are my soldiers. I don't care what you bend or even if you bend at all. As of this moment you are mine. Naruto said evenly, taking time to slowly scan his eyes over the faces of his recruits. Together we will shape the future of this world on the battlefield. First, however, myself and my officers will shape you into the instruments that our country needs to mold that future. Today will be the last time you segregate yourselves based upon your ability to bend and by what element you bend. You will select one among your number, one fire bender, one earth bender, one water bender, and one non-bender. These 4 will be promoted to specialist by me to help unify our force. Any further promotions will only come through hard work and talent. You won't get any special treatment from me. Naruto spoke clearly before nodding to Mulan who, like with his officers a few days prior, took over the ironing out of details with his troops. Naruto himself took a few steps back and watched as the unit was quickly given the opportunity to decide who would, at least temporarily, represent them as specialists. Essentially on par with a corporal in the Fire Nation army without having any true responsibility over a unit. Thankfully the groups already knew one another. The water benders had been trained together briefly and mostly in bending in their home province, while the earth benders had around 2 months of pre-training at one of the colonial bases together before being shipped to Kazkan. The fire benders had come from glowing sands just as Naruto once had, though they had received an expedited program that axed everything considered non-essential for them. Essentially anything not combat related. Lastly, the regular army troops had all come from Shijak training base on the western side of the Fire Nation Central Island. Before long the recruits had selected their leaders from their ranks. The selection was a bit odd. For the non-benders they chose the expected member of their force. Their recruit team leader in basic training, Samek. He was a bit older than most of the others and from a military family so was more familiar with the way things worked than some of the others. He was a good pick and Naruto expected him to earn advancement to at least corporal by the time he was ready to take the unit to the front. The fire bender chosen was a bit disappointing but not surprising. Izonu Ra was the 3rd son of a high-ranking Fire Nation noble and commander, but he had been selected for his place as the best among the firebenders. He was a bit arrogant, but his reports also said he was frequently found helping his fellow recruits to accomplish their tasks or better learn their bending arts. With some stress to beat the arrogance out of him, Naruto hoped he would pan out as a good member of the unit and someone his troops could go to for help when they needed it. The Earthbenders was where things became strange for Naruto. Or a bit awkward was more accurate. Bahar was easily the oldest among the recruits. In fact, he was older than anyone in the unit and actually older than more than half of the fresh Earthbenders combined. The old man was evidently unparalleled in his ability with earthbending though, and he had a proven track record of not only keeping up with but sometimes outpacing his much younger colleagues. Naruto just hoped that the fact Naruto was not even 17 yet wouldn't cause Bahar to try and test his authority. Insubordination and punishment for it would make what he wanted to achieve so much harder. Finally, the water bender among the group. The strangest of the choices. At least at first glance. A young girl, only a year older than Naruto, Kita. Well, they all called her Kita. The water tribe of the Boiling River province tended to have incredibly long names. Kita was evidently selected because she was the daughter of the man-appointed chief of the Fire Nation's loyal water tribe. She was a capable bender, but there were others stronger. Her strengths lay more in healing and hand-to-hand combat, which surprised Naruto somewhat, as the water tribe he had learned of were usually described as either being benders or warriors, rarely both, and even more rarely as women. Then again, this was the Boiling Water tribe. They were as aggressive in combat as Fire Nation citizens should be. Following the election of their representatives, Naruto's officers made good on his word. The unit was blended, with every platoon being composed of a mix of benders and non-benders as well as elements. The first platoon, which would be led by Naruto and Mulan directly, was also where the specialists found themselves. Naruto hoped to move most of his more experienced veterans into the other platoons by the end of the training cycle so that he could promote some of the new recruits in his own. Soon training began. Naruto found himself rather disappointed by the forces he had been given to command. Overall, the men and women of his new company were given just the basics of instruction on marching and parade formations. How to clean their uniform and armor and maintain their quarters. The most basic of basics. At least the benders had all received some form of advanced training with their elements. He couldn't imagine the pain in the ass it would have been to try and educate them in their elements when all he knew was fire bending. Even then, fire bending came more as an instinct to him. He struggled to properly teach other fire benders their element too. Well, not all of them. Azula was like he was. She almost instinctively took to fire bending. He could teach her rather easily. It was a pity that she wasn't here too. The company fell into a routine. Days were harsh under Naruto's command, and the men and women spent nearly as much training their bodies in grueling marches and runs as they did in familiarizing themselves with the formations and commands they would need to have memorized and be able to respond to instinctively in combat. The runs were especially hard on the recruits, as Naruto insisted they endure overly long distances with all of their gear on. They couldn't complain even when forced to keep the insane pace though. Naruto and his officers were right there beside them, participating in the exact same physically demanding tasks that they demanded the soldiers complete. Naruto was careful to keep the health of his troopers in line though. While running, he noticed several of the soldiers were struggling to keep pace. Even those that he could tell were physically more capable than their comrades. He called for a break and let them rest for a bit before slowly making his way through the ranks to talk to as many of his soldiers as he could one-on-one. He soon found 3 issues that were the root cause. The first being rather easy to fix with some help from Specialist Kita and a handful of other water benders in the unit. Most of the soldiers had not been taught the proper way to treat themselves for things like blisters or other smaller injuries that, if left to continue worsening over time, could end their career as soldiers entirely. Thankfully, Kita and her fellow water benders were able to heal those affected, and Naruto himself explained better ways of maintaining the hygiene and care for their feet. Part of the issue remained though. Some of the soldiers found that a handful of the staff operating Kazkin Base's supply depot were less inclined to do their duty than they should have been. Some had tried to coerce the recruits into even paying for things that were to be supplied by the army, or in a couple of cases that had been reported to Naruto, only now after investigating it, a few of the female soldiers were being pressured to exchange favors of the sexual kind for basic supplies they needed. Needless to say, Naruto and his officers were furious and stormed the supply unit's barracks with minds filled full of righteous vengeance. Naruto restrained himself from permanently damaging the supply officers, but they were roughed up terribly. That wasn't enough for Naruto though. They wanted to keep his subordinates under-supplied and force them to buy it from them. Naruto was happy to return the favor. The supply officers were effectively robbed, every item in their barracks taken, even the bedding and in a couple cases the beds themselves. The items were then sold back to them at exorbitant fees. Unless they couldn't pay, then the item was simply given to members of Naruto's own force. The supply officers initially made to complain until Naruto threatened to report their attempts at forcing themselves on his soldiers. Something he was certain that their commander, a General Yolan, a woman who was notorious for cracking down on such acts with her subordinates especially harshly. They quieted down and took their situation on with that. They had no real choice after all. The third issue was the most difficult in remedying though. It wasn't due to poor training in something, or easily healed with bending. It wasn't because they were being mistreated or extorted in some way. No, the final major issue plaguing his unit's effectiveness was their mindset. Most considered their force to be little more than a throwaway unit. They believed the words of plenty of the bigots that claimed the mixed unit was doomed to failure and that it was a waste on a massive scale. It was worsened as many of those voices claimed support for the idea of water benders and earth benders being placed into the military but didn't want them mingling with the true Fire Nation soldiers. To solve it, Naruto decided some more bonding was required and so ordered a long mess period one night. It was normal for him and the officers to join their troopers in the mess for mealtime. Naruto believed that distancing themselves from their soldiers even for a meal would be poor for morale. Especially when he was trying to advance the meritocratic traits of his nation more and more through this unit. Tonight was a bit special though. After sitting and eating, and even chatting with his soldiers, Naruto finished his food and let the majority of the hall finish as well before he stood and cleared his throat. The room slowly quieted and turned to see their commander standing before them. Let me start out by saying these last 3 months training with you all has truly opened my eyes to the potential for our nation. You all represent the best of our people, no matter your background, you really are the best. You wouldn't be here otherwise. After all, I selected you. Naruto said, getting a few to sit up a bit straighter as he spoke. That being said, I see the potential, but I also see the obstacles in our path. The mindsets that keep us from reaching that peak that I know, in my very soul, that we rightfully deserve to reach. The words of generations of our predecessors weigh all of you down. The beliefs that everything must be a certain way continue to keep you from putting your everything into it because all of you think in the end it's not worth it. Naruto continued, getting his soldiers to avert their eyes slightly in secretive shame at him, hitting the nail on the head. It makes sense, right? All your lives you've been told that things I keep telling you are impossible. Why should my words mean anything? I'm just one man. A bastard. Someone who shouldn't be here commanding you now even. Naruto let that sink in while a few shifted even more uncomfortably. Naruto had their respect. The fact that by their society's standards he should have been relegated to a hidden blemish on his family name did not sit very well with them. Here I am though. And here you are, despite being told that you water benders are lesser than a fire bender, or you earth benders are simple-minded, or that you non-benders are hardly even people, and even you among the fire benders being told that you were placed into this unit because your career and your life is worthless. You all pretend you don't hear it, but the way you act, I can see it weighing all of you down. So I have to ask you all, why? Naruto asked, lifting his arms up for emphasis. The confused stares he got back from his audience pushed him to continue. Why would you listen to them? Why would you let their words mean anything to you? Why would you let their words be considered more honest than my own, or my officers? You take the words of arrogant and bitter people set in their ways who sit here in the homeland or behind the walls of colonial cities and complain. They complain and they judge and they truly have no real experience outside of hearing the generation before them do the same thing. You take their words to heart, though. Naruto said, getting the listeners before him to nod slowly. Why listen to them? Why not listen to me and your commanders? You are here to be prepared for battle and war. We have seen that war. We have fought those battles. We have faced certain death and fought on, and you think the words of some stuck-up nobodies will cause us to bend to their will? Not a chance. Naruto grinned at his soldiers and small smirks reflected on many of their faces. The only hang-up here is you. I can't decide this for you. You have to decide for yourselves. Do you want to be here? Do you want to prove all of them wrong for doubting you? It's all I've ever wanted. No, more than that I need it. I am going to prove to everyone who looked down on me and judged me as a blemish on the royal family that I am so much more than they could ever hope to be. Are you going to do it too? Do you have the guts to even try? Naruto asked, raising his voice, almost taunting his men. The murmured response was one he expected but not one he wanted. It doesn't sound like it to me. Naruto barked and a few of the recruits began to more loudly claim they would. Are you just going to let words dictate your lives? Words that mean nothing? He demanded, and a few recruits were standing now, shouting back at him that they wouldn't. The room as a whole was in agreement. Only you can decide this course for yourself. Tonight there will be no training. Take the extra 3 hours this gives you to think about what I've said and make your decision. Come tomorrow morning, I hope to see you made the brave choice. The right one, Naruto said a bit more peacefully before turning and leaving, closely followed by Mulan as they returned to the commander's quarters. You are just full of speeches lately. Mulan joked. Yeah, well, they really need a kick in the ass. We won't get anywhere with this unit if they don't believe in themselves. Naruto said as they stepped into the building. After that, I don't think it will be a problem. She said simply before they both went their separate ways in the building to separate rooms. Mulan hesitated only briefly at her door as she glanced at her commander and smiled faintly. She knew he would achieve his goal here at Kazkan base. She'd make sure of it. In the weeks following his speech made in the mess hall, the soldiers of the 1st Mixed Company had clearly done as he had asked. They pushed themselves harder, retained more of what they were taught, and generally speaking had a more positive mentality about their placement with the company. Soon leaders among the recruits began to truly show their heads. As expected, those made specialists on the onset quickly rose to prominence and respect among their peers, and not just among those that were their own original batches of trainees. The sight of Specialist Kita taking the initiative to check on not only her own platoon members' conditions but the rest of the company, and almost naturally taking a position of leadership among the company healers, had a grin on Naruto's face. He expected to make her sergeant by the time they shipped out for the front. The other specialists looked to be at least worthy of being corporal by the time they finished training here at Kazkan. Surprisingly, Izonu, the formerly arrogant firebender, had shaped up properly ever since he had seen the way Naruto and his officers handled the supply situation. While he had little to offer so far as tips for the other benders, his experience surrounding the life and struggle of those in the army made it easy for him to take a leadership role among not just his fellow firebenders but the rest of his platoon as well. Today things were accelerating though. They were moving beyond what Naruto considered as the basics for his unit and into the combat training. More specifically, Naruto and his officers had erected a modular obstacle course that mimicked a village or a battlefield and could be easily altered for practicing different layouts. Each squad was being separated from the rest of the unit and run through the course individually to give them an idea of what to expect. The first 2 times really bolstered their confidence. They easily eliminated the wooden cutout targets and seized their objectives. By the 3rd round though, Naruto decided to shake things up. As first squad moved toward the village, Naruto suddenly descended upon them and threw the sergeant of their squad to the floor roughly while glaring daggers at the second in command. Your leader was just killed in battle. What do you do? Naruto demanded. The young man stammered for a moment too long and Naruto threw him to the ground as well. You. He snapped, jabbing a finger at the next closest member of the team. They're both dead now, what do you do? Find cover. The recruit bellowed. Then find it. Don't just stand there. Naruto roared and the team members scattered into covered positions to avoid pebbles that Naruto began flicking randomly to mimic earthbender attacks. What about your downed comrades? He roared in question toward the frazzled recruits. But they're dead, sir. One of them replied. Are they? I said they were, but did you even check to see if they were? Sergeant, how dead are you? Naruto asked, turning to face the first man he had pushed over. Not very, sir. The sergeant replied, sending a scathing look to the troops under his command. So you're not dead. But you were hit, Sergeant. What does that make you? Naruto asked. I guess wounded, sir. He replied. Wounded, and my men left you on the field of battle alone? Naruto asked, pretending to be shocked and outraged. Looks that way, sir. The sergeant replied. Well, shit, Sergeant, if that happened to me I think I would have to punish them. Naruto said, getting the recruits to pale. I agree, sir. Perhaps you have a suggestion? The sergeant asked with a gleam in his eye. I have always loved a good sprint to help me correct my actions. The longer and the faster the better. Naruto said as he scratched at his chin. Good idea, sir. I'll have to make sure they know the weight of their actions and make them perform runs in full gear. The sergeant said as he climbed to his feet. Good on you, Sergeant. Naruto cackled before turning his attention to the second squad, which gulped at the attention they were suddenly receiving. He then turned to look at the full company beside him and spoke loud and clear for all of them to hear. We are going into battle. Your enemy will not stand there like wooden cutouts and let you kill them. They will fight back, and some of you will die. However, if I ever find out you left your comrades behind to save your own skin, then I will deal with you personally before I let them have a go at you too. He let that sink in for a moment before signaling Mulan to send the second squad into the course while he disappeared within to wreak havoc on them. For a year Azula found herself being shadowed as well as tutored by the Sun Warrior Chell. The young woman was annoyingly competent and capable. Azula was used to outgrowing any form of teacher she was placed under in record time. Chell seemed to always be advancing just out of her own reach, which was infuriating. The Totec woman simply taunted her about it before pushing her into another training cycle that left her exhausted but oddly content. Such a strange feeling. That of being content. Not happy really, she wanted other things. More time spent with Mai and Tai Li, a chance to visit Naruto again. But she was content. For now. She had her ambitions, of course, she just knew it was not yet time to pursue them openly. Oddly enough, Chell knew this as well and seemed completely supportive of her. It was strange to have such a female role model in her life to help her and iron out what Chell referred to as less than useful personality traits. Azula was never going to be some warm and bubbly girl like Tai Li was, but in part from her closeness to her friends and support with Naruto, Chell was able to round Azula out as she finished her training for her role as the new crown princess of the Fire Nation. That didn't mean Azula was especially pleased to have Chell around all the time. She was thankful, perhaps, of her presence, but the bond she had with the mockingly curvaceous woman was unique and often a bit raw. Chell was one of a handful of people in the world that could be brutally honest and even negative with her. The only one she hadn't known since her childhood either. No, the two bickered and made snide remarks toward one another more than anything else, but for some reason they also preferred to keep the other nearby. Azula wondered why often enough, but usually came to the conclusion that she was probably a bit mad, all things considered. After all, Chell had even managed to make her confront the reality that her father saw her as nothing but a useful piece in the machine of his ambition, and she still loved him. Azula, Snap out of whatever daydream you're having and get back to work. You wanted me to make sure you were studying the more civil side of rule. Well, I'm not going to waste my time if you are just going to stare off into space. Chell said after flicking the princess's ear. Azula clicked her teeth but did as Chell said and got back to reviewing the paperwork before her. A large collection of copied military reports for her father. Mostly regarding new recruit numbers and unit deployments into the colonies. One stood out though. The copy in her hand had an envelope pinned to it, confusing her. That is until she read which unit the report was for. It was Naruto's company. The letter was addressed to her as well. Finally he writes. Azula said happily before quickly schooling her features when she noticed the smirk on Chell's face. I suppose you can take a break for a while. Just don't take too long. We aren't working on that new alteration to your form until after we finish this. Chell said as she left to go to wherever it was that Chell went when she wasn't tutoring or minding Azula. The princess rolled her eyes as she blew a lock of her hair out of her face. Still, once the door had clicked closed, she scrambled to open the letter as quickly as possible. Naruto had been writing less lately, ostensibly because he said there wasn't anything interesting going on with training his company. It annoyed Azula and she planned to have words regarding that with him once she saw him again. Only one more year and she would be out there by his side after all. 16. The age they had agreed upon for her to attend the field. Sometimes she was rather angry with herself for allowing him to talk her into agreeing to that. She just couldn't argue with him when he got all passionate and preachy though. When those eyes of his seemed to glow with power and he looked past you at some potential future only he could see. Like he was looking into no. She didn't want to think about that right now. Chell always seemed to know when she did and the woman was incredibly annoying when she was taunting her about her supposed crush. Azula was the crown princess of the Fire Nation, she didn't do crushes. Let's see what you have to say, Naruto. The princess said, pushing her previous thoughts from her mind with a small, content smile. Something that was becoming a greater occurrence lately. Azula trailed her eyes across the paper as she read. Her cousin explained to her the final training exercises he had put his unit through. Mock battles pitting platoons against one another and grueling obstacle courses in the steaming bog on the far side of the island from Kazkan base. She giggled freely at his description of Mulan having to pull a pair of recruits out of the muck and getting pulled in herself. The additional note in Mulan's handwriting saying that Naruto had pushed her in and not to let him convince her otherwise brought an even broader smile to her face. The smile slowly faded as she felt the desire to join with them return to her chest. She missed him, Naruto. Chell, Ty Lee, and Mai were fine, they kept her happy and she did consider them friends. Even Chell, though Ty Lee was recently more than just a friend. It wasn't the same. She missed those days when she was little, spent running around the palace with him. Just enjoying their time together and being little terrors for all the nobles that came to court. Before her mother let slip what she thought of Azula and then disappeared. Before her grandfather died and her father became even more of whatever he truly was. Back before Iroh chose Zuko as a replacement son and she watched part of Naruto break. The thought of Iroh and Zuko was the final straw that shattered her good mood. Thinking of them as they sailed around the world, free to do whatever they wished. Naruto had been right when he called them barely better than deserters. After all, Zuko's banishment was only from the homeland. He was welcome in the colonies and was still recognized as a prince of the Fire Nation. He should have been out there fighting the war alongside their countrymen. It was what Azula would have done. It was what she longed to do. With a sigh she glanced one last time at the last few lines of her letter from Naruto. His company was finished with their training and as of him sending the letter would be shipping out the next day for the small colony of Koyosi, where Naruto would march his troops up to rejoin his old commanding officer near the front lines. Which was good. Over the last year many of the gains the Fire Nation had made, thanks to the rout of the Earth Kingdom forces at the Battle of the Crossroads, had been rendered effectively null and void. Their population was far too large and they just overwhelmed the more vulnerable positions held along the front, pushing it back to within 100 miles of the front that Naruto had been fighting on a year prior. He didn't say it in the letter, but Azula could tell by the way he talked about where they were going that he was frustrated with the upper levels of command that he felt had failed to properly hold the gains his soldiers had died for. She smiled at that. Her Naruto was almost fatherly in his care for his soldiers, despite being younger than all of them. With a final sigh, she set the letter aside and got back to work. She wanted to be able to match him whenever she joined him next year, so she needed as much practice with Chell on perfecting her forms as she could get. She needed to fight through this damned paperwork review first though. And that is the chapter, everyone. Short, I know, and no real action, but obviously our boy is going back to battle next chapter with a bit of a chip on his shoulder, and his soldiers all have something to prove. The first mixed company didn't so much march down the road as it slogged through the thick muck of what was supposed to be a roadway. As Naruto expected, the closer to the front they were, the more the situation deteriorated. The muddy roads and eerie silent farms and villages reminded him far too much of his time with the Jaguar Company. What ate at Naruto the most though was just how close to the old frontline this position was. After the Battle of the Crossroads had happened, they had one for the few properly unified and organized Earth Kingdom armies in a full-blown rout. The Fire Nation had been practically knocking at the doors of Omashu, one of the few true Earth Kingdom strongholds that remained. At least he could appreciate being placed under the leadership of his same old commanding officer. The colonel's career had temporarily stalled out in the face of the string of major defeats the Fire Nation had suffered. Of course, the arrogant ass that was General Bying had bumbled them into impossible scenarios, so Reiko had no chance at victory. As Naruto had expected, the man had chosen the lives of his troops over saving face at court. He adored that about the man. It was something Naruto himself strived to apply to his own career. As the company marches into the current encampment garrisoned by Colonel Reiko's force, he couldn't help but feel both disappointed and nostalgic. Nothing had changed. Any boost of morale gained by the rapid advancement recently was gone since their defeats had forced them so far back. The tents and broken down buildings of the ruined village were Naruto's home away from home though, and after ordering his troops to fall out, he, along with his officers and squad leaders, headed toward the farmhouse converted into a headquarters. As he stepped in, the young captain smiled at the sight of Reiko once again. The old man looked tired and gray. Literally gray, as his hair both on his head and face had gone a silvery color almost like metal. He was clearly suffering from the stress of the war, but he looked as strong and imposing as ever. Colonel. Naruto greeted warmly with a salute, followed by Mulan and the rest of his subordinates that had accompanied him. Naruto. At ease. Damn, it's good to see you. Mulan. Reiko said as he nodded in the direction of Naruto's right hand. Sounds like you've been in need of some support. Sounds like you have a bunch of green recruits. You know what we're about around here. This really isn't the place for them. It will look bad for the first mixed unit in the military to lose most of its number in its first campaign. Reiko said. With all due respect, Colonel, my people are green but I'm not. Naruto said seriously, causing his commander to stare back at him. No, you are not. The colonel admitted. Reiko's force was currently on rotation away from the real front lines a few more miles inland. It was fine with Naruto. He needed to get his people used to the reality of the Great War anyway. As much as he had tried, no amount of training would properly prepare for the real thing. The current focal point of this region was combat around a bridge that the Fire Nation had hastily constructed during their advance inland. The Earth Kingdom had been smart to destroy as many paths across the waterways during their retreat, but as they pushed the Fire Nation back, they easily rebuilt any bridges themselves. Now, however, the Fire Nation was essentially making its stand in trying to stop the slow plodding counter-offensive that their enemy had been using to drive them backward. All but this one metal bridge had already been destroyed, making the fighting around Bridge D3 especially intense. After all, if they lost their foothold on the other side of D-3, then they would be forced back onto the other side of the river and likely slowly pushed back to the next waterway, which was unacceptable. As it was, they were already a stone's throw from some of the more isolated Fire Nation colonies, and it was unacceptable that they would be put under threat. Reiko had brought Naruto as well as the other company commanders together to go over the current situation for when they were placed on the front. The figures on the map did not look good for them. Outnumbered was an understatement, and of course the bridgehead was at the base of a valley between two steep hills. The only cover was the remains of a ruined village on the other side of the river. "This is awfully familiar," Naruto said as he looked at the diagrams. "At least we don't have to paddle across the river this time." Reiko replied as he nodded his head. "A lot better first rotation for my people then." "What's the plan?" Naruto asked. "Thought you'd never ask. The rest of our force is slated to rush up to reinforce our troops on the bridgehead. Your force won't be using the bridge. Between your water benders and your earth benders, I want you to come in on the southern flank. If possible, I want you to do it without revealing your position to the enemy so that you can hit their positions from the rear," Reiko explained. Naruto eyed the map. He then turned to look at Kita. She was a sergeant already, the highest ranking of the new recruits. She'd earned her position after saving nearly 10 of her fellow recruits' lives after an accident aboard the ships nearly drowned them. "Can our water benders get us across unnoticed?" he asked. Kita stared at the map and ran the estimates of her people through her head. She was more of a healer in focus, but her training in the weeks since coming to the mainland had expanded her knowledge of bending a bit forcefully. "We could walk across the bottom while bending the river over us. It would take a lot out of everyone, and if they lost concentration while doing it, we would be as good as dead," she explained. Naruto eyed the map but slowly began to nod his head. It was a bit risky, however it would put them behind the Earth Kingdom lines without giving them away if they could pull it off. The idea of walking under a river had him suddenly missing the paddle boats he had once used. "If you're sure, then tomorrow night your people will move as soon as the sun sets. You'll take as long as you need for your people to rest back up, then attack before sunup. We'll wait for your attack, then join in. Hopefully this will force them off of those hills and allow us to break through again," Reiko commented. "Sadly, it's another set of rivers between us and any real progress," Naruto commented, getting a disappointed nod from Reiko. He knew the terrain in these parts all too well by now. It was going to be complicated to retake the land leading up to Omashu, but that was the task they were given. "Feed and rest your people as best you can, Naruto. You'll need the energy," Reiko said before dismissing them. The leadership of the first mixed company saluted their commander and headed off toward the large barn that had been converted into a mess hall for the troops present. "Our commander is a bit of a character," Kita commented to her captain, waiting to see his reaction. The commanding officer said nothing, but Lieutenant Mulan suddenly turned her head to give the younger soldier a scathing look. "Colonel Reikos was our commander during our first tour on the front. He pulled us out of the grave more than once," she said simply. Kita and the other leaders from their force cringed at that. Even those that had been soldiers in Naruto's unit prior to the crossroads hadn't realized how close their two leaders were to the colonel. "Fall out and find some chow. I expect everyone to have us a place set up for camp in the next 2 hours. After that, I want a general assembly for the company called outside my new quarters," Naruto said simply. Dismissed. Mulan called and the soldiers moved to join their own subordinates in eating. As the soldiers headed off, Naruto continued past the barn toward the remains of what was probably a tool shed at one point. The tarps and short sandbag walls around it made it clear that the building had been converted into a more important job than before. The small sign nailed to the front of the building denotes it as the company's commander quarters, which meant Naruto and Mulan would be sharing a space. Just like their first time on the front. Privacy was a privilege after all. The two of them thanked the camp workers that brought them their own meals before they settled in and made themselves comfortable on the tiny one-room space. Cozy. Mulan joked. Better than a tent for sure. Naruto commented. That was a fair point. There was just enough room for two small army cots and a single desk. It didn't matter though. They wouldn't even have a full 2 days to stay here. At least not if things worked as they planned. The pair quickly ate and changed, ignoring one another as much as possible while they did so. Thankfully for Naruto's teenage heart, Mulan wore tight chest bindings beneath her uniform. He doubted he wouldn't try to sneak a peek if that wasn't the case. She was a beautiful woman after all. Naruto turned to the desk instead and set to work writing at a letter to send back home to Azula. Mulan finished dressing and watched her commander at work. A small flutter in her chest at the sight of him looking so peaceful caught her a bit off guard. Her eyes settled on the letter and she frowned just so slightly. A pang of jealousy at the attention her gave the princess even here so far away from her stung at her, but she quickly smothered it. Her captain might not see himself as such, but he was a royal. It was only fitting that his mind be centered on the princess. That being said, she was disappointed that her choice to change at the same time as him hadn't had more of an effect. She had little doubt that her captain would eventually rise to high enough station that the Fire Lord would wish to marry him to Princess Azula. He was an incredibly powerful and talented bender. Azula was just as talented, and they were both set to shape the future of their entire world. Mulan was just an army officer in comparison. Yet royals had mistresses, did they not? Fire Lord Azulan was known for it, though he was evidently quite careful not to soar bastards unlike his elder son Iroh. She could be fine with that situation either way. Mulan, are you alright? You're staring. Naruto asked as she realized he had stopped writing and was looking at her in confusion. Just thinking of tomorrow night. She said quickly. It's going to be tough, but better that than our first few battles, right? I just hope the company is ready for what will come. We might get the drop on the rock heads, but that doesn't mean they are just going to throw in the towel and surrender. There will be bloodshed, Naruto said a bit worriedly. We prepared them all as best as we could sit. Better than we were. Better than any other new recruits stepping into combat for the first time. Maybe. I just hope it actually counts for something this time. He grumbled before turning back to the letter. Mulan felt the same way in regards to their lost comrades. So much death, and all for practically no real change. Still, there was just a feeling inside her gut that told her that someday soon things would be changing very quickly. It was dark. The moon was out, but the cloudy night sky kept most things in the dark as the first mixed company moved into position along the bank of the river. There was quiet murmuring barely audible over the distant rumbling. A few of the recruits wondered if it was thunder. Perhaps a storm was coming in. The veterans knew better. The continuous rumble wasn't coming from the clouds but rather from the battle being had at the bridgehead. No doubt the Earth Kingdom army was hammering Reiko's men there, trying to force them back or at the least keeping them contained until they built up enough of a force to crush through the defenses. Pass the word along. Quietly form into groups, 2 water benders per group. They know what we're doing. Naruto ordered in a voice just above a whisper. The murmur changed as junior officers and sergeants quickly passed word along and the men and women under his command shifted into their groups. Soon they were organized, though a few sergeants had to yank a couple soldiers around in the darkness to get them into position. Kita stood at her commander's shoulder along with a slightly older woman who Naruto felt bad at not recalling the name of. It wasn't time to dwell on that though. His group, consisting of his inner circle as well as those that had once been the elected leaders among his recruits, were the first to step into the water. As they advanced, Kita and the other woman began an intricate dance-like bending pattern. Arms waving, hips twisting. In other conditions it would have almost been like the belly dancers he'd heard of populating the desert provinces of the Earth Kingdom. He figured that such a thing would be used for warfare in this conflict. By now he wondered if there was anything that wouldn't be found useful and utilized in the fighting. It was an interesting experience, walking along the bottom of the river. The path was understandably muddy, but it was like the muck of the overused roads they had marched on. More like wet ground after a hard rain. Their boots didn't get sucked down or stuck. That had been something he'd worried would stall their movement, but they made better time than he could have hoped, and before long they were emerging from the river on the other side. He couldn't stop the feral grin that crept onto his features. This was going to be an utter rout for the Earth Kingdom if the plan continued on as smoothly as this. After the entire company had been assembled on the enemy shore, Naruto once more sent a series of whispered orders to organize his soldiers. They reformed into a rough formation with non-benders at the forefront armed with shields and blades, while the company's fire-benders and earth-benders stayed close by to step forward at a moment's notice and assault the enemy. Lastly was the rest of the non-benders and water-benders. With a silent signal, the group began to move quietly over the hilly terrain toward the rear of their enemy. It would take them a good while to reach the right position at this pace, but it was a relaxed gait that allowed the water benders to regain their strength from bending through the river and keep the company overall in pretty decent shape. They wanted to be as rested as possible for the coming assault. It was still quite dark by the time they reached their position. A straight shot with a gentle incline up to the Earth Kingdom positions. They could make out the fires and movement at the hilltop. Naruto ordered a halt though. They weren't exhausted, but still he gave them all a moment to ready themselves for what was about to happen. The time felt simultaneously like it was gone in a flash and like it had drug on for hours. As if the spirits themselves were lending a hand, a fog began to settle over the whole valley. Morning remained a few short hours away, but the humid foggy air felt like it was wrapped around them. Quiet and eerie. Finally Naruto signaled the company to form up and the soldiers followed his command immediately. The young commander looked on at his mostly green company and worried once again about the possibility of this somehow backfiring and getting the entire group trapped on the wrong side of the battle lines. He pushed the thought from his mind and waved the company forward. Muffled orders from lieutenants and sergeants had the force advancing. Slowly at first they plodded across the empty space between themselves and the hill. However, as they advanced, their pace began to steadily pick up. The rumbling thumps of footfalls and jingling sound of weapons and armor as they moved began to increase in volume. As it did steadily, the need for silence fell away and a new need to rouse their determination to spill their enemy's blood picked up. It started out as a couple shouts here and there, but by the time the company was running full tilt toward the enemy camps, they were roaring out in a full-blown charge. Of course, this eliminated any real surprise, but the main surprise had been the sudden charge from behind. The complete opposite direction as to where their enemy expected them to be. It made the Earth Kingdom's reaction slow and sloppy. Too slow and sloppy to properly rally their troops as Naruto and his company rapidly closed the distance. Screams and shouts of alarm could barely be heard by the young captain over his own soldiers' war cries. As he began to crest the hill, just a few steps to the right of Mulan as both led the charge, he was already twisting his body into familiar motions that brought forth gouts of flame. The nearly as familiar screams of terror and pain among his targets pushed him on to the next set of enemy soldiers before him. Nearby, Mulan drove her weapon through the chest of a stumbling earthbender before Naruto lost sight of her in the rush of bodies. The two sides clashed at the edge of the Earth Kingdom camp. Soon gouts of flame swept over the tents and soldiers alike just as boulders claimed the lives of both sides of the conflict. Blades of water quickly became reddened as they carved up the enemy. Naruto fought harshly and burned his way down a narrow trench line into what appeared like a commander's tent. Inside, a young and clearly high-born nobleman had just finished pulling on his uniform. At the sight of Naruto, his eyes widened and his arms instinctively moved into a bending form. He never got further than the initial pose though, as Naruto planted a fist into his face and clamped his hands onto his enemy. Direct heat, channeled from Naruto into his opponent, began causing the young officer's face to steam and warm up as he let out an anguished scream. This wasn't really bending. It was the most basic exercise for a firebender turned up to the most cruel extent. An exercise used to burn leaves and start campfires used to boil flesh and blood and torch bone. Just as the officer's eyes looked about ready to pop from the heat, Naruto felt himself roughly torn off of the man, slammed into a rock wall that most definitely hadn't been there before. A much larger and older earthbender stormed into the tent. That was when Naruto realized there were two cots inside. "Men, are you alright?" the man asked, clearly worried about the younger of the two. It wasn't hard for Naruto to figure things out. The two were identical besides the obvious differences in age and size. This man was the true commander of this Earth Kingdom unit, and the man that Naruto had just been cooking alive was clearly his son. Ming, the younger officer, evidently didn't seem to hear his father at all, as he simply sobbed in agony. Blackened handprints decorated his once flawless visage, and blood and peeling skin had ruined the rest of the boy's face. He couldn't clutch at his wounds without causing himself even more pain, so instead his hands desperately reached out, blindly grasping at anything and everything. The commander seemed to understand that his son wouldn't be recovering enough for him to speak. He turned back to destroy the firebender that had harmed his child in such a way. Instead, he hesitated for a brief moment as he noticed that Naruto was in fact even younger than his own son. It was a fatal mistake. In that brief moment, Kita had arrived into the tent and planted a spear of water through his chest and pinned him to the ground. It was brutal but obviously effective, as the commander gurgled loudly from the blood and water quickly running into his airway. Kita seemed to freeze up at the sight. Her training had been enough to save Naruto's life, but the dying man before her was dying because of her actions. She snapped out of it, and Naruto stood back to his feet and with a twist engulfed both wounded earthbender in a white-hot fire that lasted nothing more than a second. The charred corpses that remained looked more like huge pieces of firewood than human beings. Kita could hardly believe the damage done to them by what seemed to be such an easy move for her captain to pull off. Was this the end result of all those that had faced him at the Battle of the Crossroads? "Thanks for that, Kita. You saved my ass there, but we are needed outside. This battle is far from over," Naruto said. He turned and left the girl to her thoughts for a moment. She needed to fight down that grief at ending a life. It wouldn't be her last. Naruto rejoined the fight outside. He caught sight of Mulan organizing some of their troops into a battle line. The first company's earthbenders marched ahead, pushing a solid barrier of rock against the faltering earthbenders from the Earth Kingdom. Naruto had expected this kind of scenario and trained his men ruthlessly in combating people of all nations, even of the Fire Nation. In comparison, the earthbenders facing them rarely if ever battled someone of the same element in a serious wartime situation. It made Naruto quite proud of his soldiers. While the earthbenders advanced, Naruto joined in with his firebenders as they launched another assault over the camp and into the defensive lines that the Earth Kingdom forces had taken refuge in. Unfortunately for the defenders, Reiko had also begun his assault upon seeing the flank of the Earth Kingdom positions collapsing. Walls of flames fell upon the trenches and bunkers from both sides, and the Fire Nation took the hill on the smoldering corpses of hundreds of Earth Kingdom soldiers. Having lost the high ground and nearly a third of their force, the organization of the remaining Earth Kingdom forces collapsed, and the battle kicked into an even more brutal and intense storm of chaos. As many Earth Kingdom forces fled and other charged, they were easily cornered and obliterated in small groups by the better discipline and organization of the Fire Nation army. Naruto had reformed his company and begun pursuing the remnants of the Earth Kingdom center into a ruined village that acted as the central headquarters of the enemy force. He could see Kita had regained herself after taking her first life. The older waterbender that had joined his group in crossing the river lay dead nearby her, and the white-haired bender had exacted revenge for her sister in arms by separating a score of Earth Kingdom heads from their shoulders. As he had expected, the battle became a complete rout for the Earth Kingdom forces. Only the staunchest and most stubborn of the enemy remained. "Fucking traitors. You betray your own people to the Fire Nation for what?" A man howled with blood from several wounds running freely. He took on 3 of Naruto's best earthbenders through sheer willpower and rage. "They did it for a chance at a better future," Naruto said simply, and he rocketed forward with a burst of flame knocked the man off balance. His soldiers didn't miss the opening their captain had given them. The mouthy soldier was soon little more than pulp from the crushing rocks that smashed into his body. The fighting didn't stop there, and even when the battle itself was truly over, the wounded of the enemy were largely put down. It was a mercy in a way. They didn't have the materials to treat so many, and of course the Fire Nation would look after its own first and foremost. By mid-morning the last of the Earth Kingdom forces had either fled or been wiped out. Naruto and other officers had gone to report into Colonel Reiko, but had learned that the colonel had been severely wounded in the battle and been taken to a field hospital before being taken farther back for more impressive medical treatment. That had shaken both Naruto and Mulan. Reiko seemed practically invincible to the both of them. To learn he was seriously injured while they had been nowhere close by to help was jarring. Still, they were reassured that with a few short months the bitter veteran commander would be right back where he belonged. The medics had even said he'd been pissed to be getting shipped to the rear just as they made a breakthrough. Naruto had to chuckle at that. It sounded very much like Reiko. Unfortunately, while Reiko was away from the front, command of his unit was handed over to Major Yaorin. Someone that hadn't joined their force until after Naruto and his people had been given their leave. He had taken part in the advance of the Fire Nation army as well as its retreats over the last year and was a decent officer in most ways. Except that he was from a very important noble family. One that even claimed some blood ties to the royal family. Yaorin already thought poorly of the upstart royal bastard leading the first mixed company, but his bias didn't stop with Naruto alone. The major held fire benders above all else. If anything, that was the one decent thing about Naruto to him. That being said, he despised the idea of Naruto's unit to his very core. He considered non-benders as lesser, but at least he considered them citizens. The way he looked at and acted around the earth and water benders, though, it was like he expected them to leap after him to try and stab him in the back. So for over a month after their first use in battle, the company was stuck doing menial labor and construction jobs. Being put to real use, as Yaorin called it. Building roads, fixing bridges, and repairing buildings. Civilian work mostly. Naruto had initially been accepting of it. He wasn't keen on throwing his troops straight into the meat grinder, and it was only temporary until Reiko returned. Sadly, that was proving to be impossible. Yaorin seemed intent to make some kind of point of putting Naruto and his troops in their supposed place. Their rations were cut, nearly by half quantities to supposedly give the food to more deserving units. Soon after that, the food they did receive began to suffer more and more in quality until it became clear they were getting leftovers and in some cases even spoiled supplies from the rest of the force. Sadly, there wasn't much Naruto could directly do about it. Until Reiko's return, Yaorin had absolute control. At least until a higher-ranked officer became involved. As for Naruto, what was the point of having high-profile connections, like say the crown princess herself, if you didn't use them from time to time? All it would take is a simple letter. One he was happy to write home. He wanted to see Azula and her friends in the flesh again anyway. A simple little visit to inspect the troops and put any unruly officers in their place sounded good to him. He knew it would sound good to her too. A heads up, if you wanted to become my patron and possibly get early access to my updates when they happen as well as exclusive stories, look me up as Helgi writes on that site. Let's get this show on the road. The last few weeks had been a serious trial in patience. Not just for Naruto himself but for the entirety of his unit. He had done all he could to keep both morale and discipline strong among his troopers, but truth be told, with grueling tedious work day in and day out mixed with spoiled rations when they got rations at all, it was becoming an impossible task. The last 2 days, they had all been set to clear out a section of woods. Sadly, they couldn't just burn it down or overturn the earth as the wood was needed for construction. So they labored, Naruto right alongside his subordinates. Ignoring the mild mockery of other units being rotated to the front, passing them by. Eventually, though, something had to give. Naruto knew it was inevitable. Kita had been coming to him about the unit literally starving slowly, and there was sadly nothing Naruto could do. His troops were losing weight rapidly. Some were having to come up with creative ways to adjust their armor and uniforms to make sure it still fit correctly. This morning, Mulan had brought him to where a pair of his sergeants had picked up a deserter. He was young, only a little bit older than Naruto himself. Furthermore, he looked like he had probably been a strong and healthy young man prior to Major Yoren's command. Now he looked extremely thin and exhausted. They caught him just inside the sentry positions. He was headed toward the village on the other side of the hills. Mulan explained as the soldier was forced to his knees in front of Naruto. Mentally, the young captain couldn't help but curse at the major for this situation. The man wasn't even one of those that Yoren was trying to target. He was a fellow firebender, and clearly he was just as affected by the starvation and grueling labor as everyone else, no matter what bending element he had. Anything to say? Naruto finally asked after staring at the man. I swear to Agni I wasn't deserting, Captain. I know this looks bad, but I wouldn't abandon you or the others, sir. I swear it, honestly. The man begged, causing Naruto to sigh sadly. You were hoping to get a hold of some food in the village, that the short of it? Naruto asked. He was stern in tone but also kind. Yes. A pop to the head from one of the sergeants straightened him up. I mean yes, sir. You get as much food as everyone else here, myself and the officers included. What makes you think it's right for you to go off and forage for yourself? Naruto was a bit more on the stern side now. The man mumbled something until one of the sergeants popped him again. Then he spoke clearly. I don't, sir. It's just my section mate. Jun. He passed out on duty the other day and was put on medical rest. The new orders from the major cut any rations for those not taking work duty. I couldn't just sit there and watch him hardly eat anything and starve. So I shared my own rations. It wasn't enough to feed the two of us though. The soldier examined. Naruto stared down at the man. He was completely fine with the man's actions. In his shoes he would have done the same. However, if he didn't do anything, it would be telling his men that desertion could possibly be acceptable. It very much was not. Still, he wasn't about to have the man lashed or executed, and taking away a day's rations might as well be killing him, not to mention the man relying on his comrade for food. Lieutenant, I want you to bring the unit leaders to my command tent this morning. As for this man, he will be taking extra work detail assignments for the week. Naruto said before spinning away toward his tent and making his way toward it. He had some ideas, but they would just buy him time really. As it was, if Yoren pushed any more, he would be dealing with mass desertion at best, or losing half his force to starvation and the other half to mutiny at worst. Hopefully his trump card would come through for him. Azula cackled heartily as the sailor in front of her nearly passed out from Tai Li's sudden appearance. The middle-aged man likely would have handled most surprises fine, but the sudden appearance of Tai Li directly in front of his face, upside down from where she was hanging down from some pipe running through the deck, had him clutching at his chest with wide eyes while he tried to catch his breath. All right, come down, Tai Li, before the man dies. He hasn't even said what he came to tell me yet. Azula said as she made room for Tai Li to flip down to the floor in perfect form. I thought the military was made of sterner stuff. The dry tone of Mai commented as she joined the group in the corridor outside the temporary quarters of the princess and her entourage. I find that you three girls could likely stress the nerves of even the most resolute of warriors. A sultry voice joined them, as well as Chel's scantily clad form slid into the corridor from her own room. Azula rolled her eyes and frowned slightly. The change in the man's demeanor as his eyes followed the older girl poked at her poorly hidden well of jealousy. What did you rush down here to tell me anyway? She asked the man, causing his eyes to snap back to her, and the nervousness colored with respect and near worship washed back over him. The princess decided it was a definite improvement of his lust-filled eyes tracing up and down Chel. Not that the savage seemed to mind. If anything, she seemed amused, especially as she watched Azula's reactions. Yes, of course, princess. I was just coming to inform you we are beginning to dock now. We are as close to the front as we can get by ship. Steam carts have been set aside for you to use to travel the rest of the way. The man said as he saluted the young girl. Excellent. The princess said with a genuine smile that set the man even more on edge as he had grown used to the girl only shooting more predatory looks around at the crew for their entire voyage. At least we'll finally be getting off of this piece of scrap. Mai said before turning back into her room to collect her things. The sailor frowned. Their vessel was one of the nicest and fastest ship in the entire Fire Nation Navy. If they wanted to go any faster they would need a crew of waterbenders. You can return to your duties. The girls and I can find the way on our own. I assure you. Azula said as she turned and joined the others in collecting her personal items. While there were servants, or rather soldiers at the moment, to gather her basics and clothes and everything else, her personal items like the old war trophy sent to her by Naruto were things she preferred to keep track of herself. As the girls soon began loading into modified tanks turned into transports, they had to ignore the slight cramped feeling such a vehicle caused. Luxurious the steam carts were not, but they were hardy and steady. With a change of driver every few hours they could drive on through the night and make better time than with live animals. Even if Azula did secretly prefer riding a living creature over sitting on the padded seat cushion. She was an adventurous soul after all and very deep down a bit of a romantic. The idea of her riding a mongoose lizard off to find her cousin on the front lines seemed like something from a storybook. Unfortunately, time seemed to be of the essence. Naruto did not ask for help. Not normally. Not if he could avoid it. He was independent and incredibly strong, and that was what drew the two of them together as children. Independence by definition bred loneliness. Now though he needed her. It was a bit of a flip from the past when she always felt like she was the one coming to him when she was stewing with emotions she kept locked away, or when she just wanted to spend time with someone, or simply when she needed some harsh sparring or training for bending. This Major Yaorin had made a very big blunder by wronging the only person in a command position to have a direct line to Azula herself. She looked forward to correcting such bad behavior, and most of her companions looked forward to it too. As the group continued toward the front from the last riverside dock, they gradually began to see more and more battle scars. At first it was overgrown places. Trenches partially filled with mud and the beginnings of vegetation. The occasional farm in disrepair but still covered in green overgrowth. That slowly gave way to camps of refugees and muddy paths that the steam carts struggled in a bit. Though they handled it far better than the wagons and carts used by the many displaced and troubled people here. Continuing on, they began finding scorched fields and overturned roads. The plant life had begun to lessen and lessen as they got closer to the front, up to a destroyed village beside a battered steel bridge. On the other side an even more demolished town sat. Mixed with the ruined houses and shops were trenches and craters from obvious battle. The large hills nearby were clearly once healthy and green. Now they were blackened and covered in a mixture of uneven ground where earth benders had altered the topography in heavy combat. At the top of the hills more abandoned and demolished defenses and camp buildings were spread out. Azula could recognize the place from letters sent by Naruto recently. This was the site that Reiko had been wounded at, where the mixed company had turned the tide and finally halted the Earth Kingdom's advance. We're getting close, Azula said to the other girls. It's a lot worse than I expected. Haven't seen any bodies or fighting though. Mai commented. We will. From what I understand, the next thing we will come across is the rear lines. Support units, supply, and the depots where they organize the dead to be buried properly. Azula explained. We must be getting close to the actual front lines. I thought you said Naruto and his unit were stuck behind lines because of some up-jumped moron standing in the way of your. Tai Li was cut off by Azula wrapping a hand over her mouth. There was one downside to having Tai Li be her closest friend and confidant. The happy, bubbly girl was just a bit too ditzy and free-spirited. Normally it buoyed Azula's rather abrasive nature and rounded out her personality. Sometimes though it was more of a security risk. At least for Azula personally. Ty Lee wasn't about to be spouting off national information even if she knew any classified secrets. That wasn't the case when it came to the more normal aspects of Azula's life, like things she enjoyed away from prying eyes or perhaps a certain crush that the princess was certain no one but her very closest friend knew about. The princess ignored the teasing look in Chel's eyes. At least the Sun Warrior didn't say anything about it. For now. They finally came up on the main command base camp for Major Yaorin. Unlike from what Naruto had told Azula about Reiko, Yaorin kept his command center back and away from the troops doing the fighting by as wide of a margin as he could. Azula couldn't exactly say the man was a coward. From what she understood, he had fought in plenty of battles himself, but clearly he was a bit more of a commander and less of a leader, as Naruto would have put it. Azula practically grinned as the soldiers scrambled to greet the obviously important leader that was rolling into camp. Only the highest of ranks even had access to such vehicles, let alone joined along with a few actual steam tanks as an escort. There hadn't been any notification of them coming prior to this, so Azula was interested to see how they reacted to seeing the crown princess herself appearing. As the group best described as very important persons disembarked from their vehicle, Major Yaorin raced to set up as warm a greeting as he could. As he moved into a position alongside his staff and had the soldiers organized into neat lines, he stumbled at the sight of the young girl climbing out of the steam cart before him. At first he felt himself relaxing, his mind grabbing the idea that it was a mere nobleman's daughter. Perhaps her family was prospecting for a new location for the next wave of Fire Nation colonists. That tiny ray of hope evaporated as he took in the girl's appearance further. She had a more refined, domineering look than any nobleman's daughter could have. She clearly wasn't raised to charm a prestigious young man and create a family alliance. To make matters worse for the major, her hairpin was designed as the royal family's own sigil. A slightly altered design from the symbol for the Fire Nation. For her to wear it as a part of her everyday garb meant that she could only be one person. As the realization dawned on him that the crown princess had appeared in his camp, he stumbled and very nearly fell face first as he got into position beside his staff. After quickly righting himself again and trying to straighten both himself and his uniform out as much as possible. Crown Princess Azula, you honor us with this unexpected visit. The man nervously said. You must be Major Yaorin. Azula said coolly with a cruel smirk. Ah, yes, Your Highness, I am. Welcome to our base camp. The man said, trying to remain poised in the face of the current air of the nation. I expected someone different. Oh well, show me around your headquarters, they must really be something. I mean, you haven't moved more than a few miles since your leader was placed on medical leave, so surely you have had time to build this camp up into something formidable. Azula said, causing the major and his men to quail slightly at her mocking tone. Chell smirked but leaned in to whisper in Azula's ear. Laying it on a bit thick, don't you think? Please, this is just my natural charming self. I'm just cutting loose a little bit today. Azula said as they followed after the major as he led them on an impromptu tour of his headquarters. By the end of their little tour, Major Yaorin had a newfound distaste for the crown princess. He wasn't stupid enough to say anything, but Azula took plenty of joy out of the shift in his body language. He hated her, and she loved it. After all, she was here to humiliate and even remove him. First she wanted to meet with Naruto though. It had been the icing on her cake to see what little color remained in the major's face drain away as he stiffly explained how to reach Naruto and his men. She had happily given him her thanks and told him she was looking forward to seeing how well treated the mixed company was and to see them in action after hearing how they had made the recent counter-offensive possible. After they got word on where to go, they decided that the steam carts were a bit too flashy and easily targeted this close to Earth Kingdom lines. Both armies had little pockets of their forces on either side of the main line, though things were typically more conflicted on the Fire Nation side with many more partisans to combat. Instead of the carts they rode ostrich horses. Not exactly near the top of Azula's preferred steeds, but a fair amount better than walking. It was much faster than walking too. They made excellent time and by mid-afternoon were coming across the edge of a large forest in the process of being felled for construction projects across the colonies. Oddly enough, however, barring a collection of malnourished sentries scattered about that welcomed her and her group, there was no one present. Some of the mixed company soldiers escorted her and her entourage into the base camp for the company to allow her to inspect it as she pleased. The soldiers were all on edge already with her in the camp, but her command to not go and inform the captain yet had the men even more worried. They followed her commands though, not exactly proud of the appearance of everything. Azula was far less concerned about the survivalist minimalist look the camp and more so furious over the extremely poor conditions that her Naruto and his men were being forced to endure by some upstart little shit. Just the appearance of the sentries alone had her running through the breathing exercises she had been taught to keep that emotional control she was so well known for by her friends. If these men looked so starved and weak while still maintaining such a strict discipline, she could only imagine how the rest of the force was. It impressed her a bit that despite the situation, the soldiers, even the non-benders and other element benders, all kept so close to their protocol and orders. It also made her very proud of Naruto. Despite having much better food and supplies, the soldiers directly under Yaorin were far less well put together than these men. "Corporal, what is that building being used for?" she suddenly asked after wiping her hands clean. She had been inspecting the disgusting bread Naruto and his men had been eating. She wouldn't feed it to pigs. "That's the infirmary, princess," the soldier replied. "It's awfully big," Ty Lee said with a pit forming in her stomach along with the other girls. "Take me there," Azula said sternly. "Are you sure, ma'am? We don't have very many wounded," he began. "Then why do you need such a large space?" Mai asked. "Well, we have a lot of soldiers on medical right now, but most aren't actually wounded," he replied. The girls all picked up his meaning at that. "All the more reason. Take me there now," Azula commanded. "At once, ma'am," he said and led the way. She almost regretted her decision to visit the infirmary. Technically, what the soldier had said was true. There were very few wounded. Beyond the occasional partisans, the mixed company had been away from combat for a spell. Starvation and the grueling quotas impressed on them by Yaorin had been too much for much of the company. It was like looking at a room full of men and women simply waiting for the end. Ty Lee had become sick after the sight and scent hit here. They made their way rather quickly back to the center of camp after that. "That's unacceptable," Chell growled angrily. "Forgive me, ma'am, but I was told most casualties come from illness and supply issues anyway." "Are we really getting that bad of treatment from the major?" the corporal asked. "You are getting worse treatment than I would give a prisoner. Not that I have ever really imagined myself as the prisoner-taking type. Still, this is unacceptable. Take me to your captain. Now," Azula hissed as she mounted her ostrich horse. "Yes, ma'am. Follow me," the corporal replied, happy to have the crown princess herself on his unit's side. It had begun to feel like it was them and the captain against the world. Naruto bit back some laughter at the sight of Mulan being swept under the river water by Kita, who was tackled into the cool liquid shortly after. All around him the men laughed and cheered as they enjoyed a break from their normal oppressive regimen and fished for food to give their company something substantial to eat. The young captain had made it clear that the only work he was allowing any of them to do today was catching, cleaning, and cooking the fish they had managed to get their hands on. Other than that, he let the soldiers enjoy a relaxing day in the sun as they played in the waters of the slow-running river. It was going to be a hell of a reprimand when it got back to Yaorin that he had not fulfilled his quota for lumber, but Naruto's soldiers were at the breaking point. It couldn't be helped. "Are you going to enjoy the water at all, Captain?" Kita suddenly asked as she stepped up beside him. The woman had discarded her usual equipment for clothing that he had come to learn was common among the water benders that were loyal to the Fire Nation. Effectively, it was thin mesh-like netting that just barely covered her more intimate regions, showing off plenty of her tanned skin contrasting with her bright blue eyes and silvery white hair. "I'm actually enjoying myself quite a lot, Sergeant," Much better than dragging logs, anyway. Naruto replied as Mulan came up to join them, flipping her wet hair back out of her face. I can definitely agree with that sentiment. The swordswoman chimed in. Like Kita, she had ditched her uniform, though she didn't exactly have a bathing suit to change into, so simply wearing her normal undergarments was her solution. Not that Naruto was complaining, he was just a teenage boy, rank and experience notwithstanding. This was a good idea. You do know that Yaorin will punish you somehow though. Mulan commented. I know. We do what we have to though. Naruto replied. He frowned a bit as he took in the sight of his two closest subordinates. They remained incredibly beautiful and very deadly, but the food issue and work had taken its toll. They were thin. Too thin for women who were expected to be able to fight in battle. All of his soldiers were. Hell, he was too. As it was, his company could no longer properly participate in combat. Not like this. They would be decimated at best or completely destroyed. That isn't even considering the number of troops he had bedridden in the infirmary. Yaorin would get his wish one way or another, it seemed. Even if they got cycled to a forward combat position like was originally planned. They couldn't perform the tasks needed, so they were permanently stuck on this work detail. That sadly meant more of this slow, agonizing death at the hands of their own commander's bias. Captain, something's coming over the bridge. One of the camp sentries is leading. Oh. Looks like our problems are about to be history. Mulan said while sporting a conflicted smile. Naruto turned to look toward the small wooden bridge his troops had constructed a few days past. Striding across it were several sights for sore eyes. One far more than the rest. He wasted no time standing and heading over to meet them. The army captain nearly laughed as the ever-chipper Tai Li stood on her saddle and waved excitedly at him. Beside her the eternally gloomy Mai rolled her eyes and the sultry Chell waved in her own much more reserved fashion, opening and closing her hand. Azula however simply smiled toward him with a soft look in her golden eyes. He locked gazes with her the moment they were in sight and happily waited for her as she dismounted and came to him. The soldiers stared in shock as they watched the crown princess tightly embrace their captain. Many didn't truly know he was so close to her. Now though they could only stare in stunned shock. Most of them at least. Some quickly realized in their minds that things would be getting much better for them very soon. You are supposed to be clearing a forest as I have been told. Azula said as she tightly hugged Naruto. Well, the men got hungry and it's a really nice day. So I thought a small break at the river would do the army better than some more wood. He joked. I have missed you. Let's catch up more away from the eyes of an entire company though. He added a moment later as he noticed the stares of his soldiers. He grinned lightly as he saw her suppress the blush that threatened to blossom on her cheeks. They separated and Azula's happy demeanor began to slip slightly. You're thinner. New diet. It's doing wonders for me. Naruto tried to joke, but the scowl told him that the humor from earlier had been killed by this point. He could almost feel some pity for the major. Almost. That asshole had been starving Naruto's troops for too long for him to feel that bad about ending up on Azula's list of people she wanted to publicly execute but couldn't quite yet. I think we have enough food to feed the rest of the company, so it is best we probably head back to the camp. Naruto said. Yes, good. Order your subordinates to do that. You will be eating with me and the girls. Make sure you bring Mulan. Trying to manage you has earned her the reward of a good meal for a change. Azula said before spinning around in place and rejoining the entourage. Naruto chuckled at the princess's antics before giving the commands to pack everything away. He was looking forward to a hearty meal actually. She is as temperamental as always. Mulan said with a smile as she rejoined him alongside Kita. Maybe from a certain point of view. I can't help but think she's adorable though. Plus I can already tell that Major Yaorin is perhaps a day away from being sent home humiliated. Naruto said as he watched Azula head off ahead of them. Pity that he just goes home humiliated. Be better if he got some of his own medicine, I think. Kita huffed. On that we can agree, Though I don't think we can really swing starving one of the Fire Nation's elite without getting in some kind of trouble. Azula can only do so much without dragging her father's eyes in our direction. Trust me, that is the last thing we want. He already has periodic checks on us made. Naruto said. Wait, wouldn't that be a good thing? Surely the Fire Lord would do something about this too. Kita suggested. Kita, he already knows. Azula wouldn't be able to come here at all without him having an idea of what she was up to, and like I said, he checks up on us frequently. Which means he knows. Naruto explained. And he does nothing. Kita was baffled. You can kind of get an idea of the type of man the Fire Lord is. Arrogant, fickle, Mulan began. Enough, Lieutenant. You border on treason and we are in a very public setting. Naruto seemed to hiss before motioning for them to start calling up the men. They needed to head back to camp. Kita frowned as the two more experienced soldiers began giving out orders and packing things away. She was not liking the image of the Fire Nation court that was being painted by her commanding officers. At least the Crown Princess seemed to care. Though whether or not that care extended beyond her small group of loved ones was still yet to be confirmed. The mood in the mixed company's camp was likely the happiest it had been in weeks. Between the food brought in by the work detail today and the attendance of the Crown Princess and her obvious close relationship with the captain, the troopers of the mixed company felt like things were finally looking up for them. Azula had felt a bit odd at seeing the adoration in the faces of Naruto's subordinates. Usually there was such a buffer between her and the common folk of the Fire Nation. Even among the military, which was incredibly meritocratic in comparison to literally every other group in the world, she had never really interacted with people like this. The sensation of having the people seem to love her was definitely new and most definitely appreciated. Naruto had told her in the past that being feared only got one so far. She could see what he meant now. Despite all their hardships, the starving, the grueling work, and the casualties caused by combat, Naruto's soldiers looked to him almost like a father. Or at least how she imagined children would look at a father they honestly loved and respected. That made the glaring issues with her own family all the more present in her mind. The parental failures that were her mother and father. The obstacles she was steadily realizing she had to find a way to surpass if she truly wanted to be the greatest Fire Lord to ever rule her home. Respect wasn't born from fear. It was born from something else, and she intended to acquire that something the moment she could figure out just what it was. For the time being though, she planned to enjoy tonight. In the morning a little rat would be coming down to the mixed company camp to be personally humbled by her and her favorite captain. She needed to make sure both she and Naruto were in good spirits for that event. The food was delicious. I can't believe you made them cart a full chuck wagon all the way from headquarters. Naruto laughed as he looked at his soldiers enjoying the bread and other additional foods they were enjoying with their fish. Azula had really outdone herself for him this time. That ass has practically been hoarding the food meant for your unit this entire time. It seems the quartermasters were all too happy to do as he commanded in regards to your supplies. Azula said, though her smile dipped at the thought of the ungrateful pencil pushers at the rear. They'll get theirs. When Reiko comes back he'll be doling out demotions and transfers like treats at a festival. I'm actually a little excited to see it. Mulan chimed in before finishing up her fish. That is if we can stop from handing out the punishments ourselves. This is all sorts of messed up. Mai said, getting a nod from the others in agreement. The rest of the evening was pretty tame. The soldiers needed rest, and after the first true meal in recent memory most felt too full to do much besides bed down for the night. In the morning the troops were up and around by dawn as was usual and setting about work. Again Naruto ordered work detail to head to the river to fish and forage for food for the company. At this point he wasn't so inclined to really follow Yoren's orders. He could operate without too much fear of repercussions. Besides, Azula had explained her wonderfully devious little plan to deal with the man to him last night. He couldn't help but say he was excited to see it all play out. As he and his closest soldiers and officers gathered around with Azula and her entourage, Naruto didn't have to wait long for the major and his handful of commanders to make their appearance. As they disembarked from a series of carts pulled by Komodo rhinos, escorted by armored Komodo rhinos ridden by well-dressed guards, Major Yaorin and his immediate subordinates made it clear they were being as respectable as they could to Azula. That is to say, they were practically crawling forward to her feet and metaphorically licking the soles of her boots like one would enjoy a lollipop. It was something to see. Especially for those of Naruto's soldiers who had only ever seen the pompous ass that was Yaorin sneering at every breath they took. Your Highness, I am pleased to meet you once again. I see you found the captain and his unit with little issue. Yaorin greeted with extremely thick sweet tones. Even Naruto, who knew the man was a kiss ass, was a bit surprised. Well, I have found plenty of issues. Now I didn't drag you all the way out here to this decrepit little farm turned into a poor attempt at an army camp to have you kiss my feet. Though I have to say it does improve my mood a bit. Azula said while picking at her fingernails and not even bothering to look at the man essentially groveling before her. Of course. What is it that you require of me, princess? Yaorin asked, a bit annoyed that the young lady wasn't even looking at him. When he finished speaking, she did in fact turn to look at him. The bright golden eyes that she sported bore eyes into him, and he suddenly wished she hadn't decided to give him her undivided attention. There was something to be said about the eyes of the royal family. A predatory gleam that made those under their gaze squirm. An explanation primarily. Azula said simply. What? Yaorin asked in confusion. I said an explanation. I would wonder if somehow battle has given you hearing damage, but I do recall you hearing me just fine back at your camp. Azula bit out. Forgive me, princess, but an explanation for what? Yaorin asked, only to be pelted in the face by a piece of disgusting stale moldy bread thrown by Chell. What? He asked again. Azula released an exaggerated sigh. I joined the mixed company for dinner last night, and imagine my surprise when I was shown food of this quality. Do you see an issue here? Yes, your majesty. I will have the culprits that would serve you such detestable foods lashed and made an example of at once. Yaorin decreed. No need, I have it handled. She said, quickly pulling the wind from his sails just as she began to wind up for a tirade about the offense against the royal family. You do? He asked. Of course I do. Besides, you have bigger issues to worry about. After some discussion with the captain, we both realized that the supplies being given to the mixed company are nothing short of a slight. So while I will be finding a solution to this food problem to help my cousin, you will be answering to a challenge of Agni Kai for the slight against these citizens of the Fire Nation. As the one responsible for their well-being, you will be facing their leader and representative in a duel. Do you accept? Azula said, causing the major to stammer briefly before locking eyes with Naruto and sneering at the bastard captain. I do wholeheartedly, your majesty, and I thank you for looking into solutions for our supply issues. Yaorin said. Good. Then at noon we will reconvene right here and hold Agni Kai. All of those here will be witnesses. Until then, Major, prepare yourself. Azula blatantly dismissed him before pivoting and returning with her entourage and her cousin and his own little group of followers to the series of command tents set up nearby. Naruto caught up to Azula and kept pace with her. This is going to really bring back some memories if it goes how you think it will. He said. If it goes the other route, everything works out all the same. Either way, Yorin is about to be stepping down. Or any of the others of the major rank capable of taking his place? Azula asked simply. Honestly, any of them. The majority of the officers under Reiko are veterans he pulled up from lower ranks with him. They are loyal, trustworthy, and competent. Naruto shrugged. Good, I'll select one to take Yorin's place afterwards. It won't matter anyway. Your beloved Reiko will be returning sooner than later. She said with a grin, knowing that he would be happy with such good news. Today is quickly becoming the best day I have had in a while. Naruto chuckled. I know, it's almost like it's your birthday. She giggled. Yaorin should have known something was off at the excited looks of the men and women gathered to watch his Agni Kai with the young captain. He had expected a hard fight with the captain and that would be the end of it. Like many officers brought in after the Battle of the Crossroads, he considered Naruto's legend to have been incredibly exaggerated. He was a young boy, no doubt skilled, but for some time now he had been starving and exhausted. Yaorin was extremely skilled in bending and tactics. Or so he was often told by his closest companions. Now though, as he stepped into the impromptu arena, he frowned. The sun hung high overhead and he, like every firebender, was feeling at the top of his game. However, across him was not the captain. Instead it was the young Fire Nation princess, clad in silky attire meant for exercise or perhaps some sort of seductive dance. As if she knew he would not dare to fight against her. He began to say, only to be cut off. You have slighted the citizens of the Fire Nation by starving and abusing them. Subordinates of yours they may have been, Major, but at the end of the day they are mine to do with as I will. They are mine to protect and to care for. The people of the Fire Nation, no matter if they are a bender or not, or what element they can bend, are my responsibility, and you have harmed them when entrusted to do your best for them. All out of spite, Azula said, clearly making a show of it all. Yaorin glanced at the faces around the edges of the arena. The mixed company seemed to have fully returned from wherever their captain had sent them. They all looked to the girl across from him with practically religious adoration as she spoke. The few that looked at him seemed ready to murder him in his sleep. This was a very bad place for him to be. Not that he had realized just how bad. Directly behind him Naruto stood and waited. Watching. Azula expected the Major to try and beg, much like Zuko had done against his father years ago. If she was wrong though, Naruto was not about to give the Major an opportunity to actually fight the princess. Either way, Yaorin would be facing an execution. Azula didn't much care for the idea of honor anyway. If anything, it was just a means to an end for her. Well, Major, are we fighting? Azula asked. The man stammered for a moment before dropping into a bow almost identical to the one her brother had in the past. Instead of Ozai approaching and goading him for a fight though, it was Azula as she strode to a place right in front of the man. Stand and fight for your honor, Yaorin, she said stiffly. The man continued, only to beg for forgiveness, so Azula leaned down with a careful concealed grin as she did so. It was wise of you not to fight me. I will at the least make it quick for you. Had you tried to attack me, my sweet captain would have boiled you from the inside out for it. Hold still, she whispered into his ear before wrapping a hand around his throat and bending heat into her palm and fingers until a gout of flame burst forth, ending the Major instantly. The audience was silent at the display. It was officially a display of dishonor and cowardice, but at least the firebenders present knew what exactly had just happened was nothing short of an execution. Azula stood stock still for a moment as she stared down at the corpse in her palm as pits of ash and smoke blew away from her skin. Realizing she was reacting a bit too openly to the act, Azula turned and made her way to the command tents. Randomly designating one of the other majors from the forces as the interim commander until Reiko's return. Naruto and Azula's friends quietly returned to the tents as well. It seemed that there had been a portion of the princess's plan neither she nor they had really considered. How would she react to actually taking a life with her own hands? Azula stared out over the valley. She had suddenly found herself wanting moments of peace and quiet over the last couple of days. Her friends had given her the space she wanted, mostly at the behest of Chell, which made her truly appreciate the woman. The soldiers stationed here had also given her a wide berth, thankfully. It would have normally brightened her day to see the reverence that they treated her with. It went beyond the normal worship that the common folk of the Fire Nation gave to the royal family. It was closer to the adoration her cousin got, though less intimate. It annoyed her that she couldn't enjoy it like she wanted to. Her head was too caught up in her emotions, which really annoyed her since she had become so accustomed to having absolute control and understanding of her emotional position. Or as close as she could. Staring at the sun is bad for your eyes, even for us firebenders. Naruto said as he stepped up beside her. She glanced toward him before turning her eyes back out over the valley bathed in the light of the setting sun. He already looked healthier. Sure, he hadn't gained back any weight yet, but his face looked less hollow and the rings under his eyes had faded away. A look mirrored in his unit. Already some were managing to be released from the infirmary. It would be well over a month before the unit was in any sort of true fighting shape though. I'm not staring at the sun. Just enjoying the view of the valley. It is pretty, for being in the land of mud. She replied, managing to throw in some mockery toward the Earth Kingdom. It really is. You might be surprised, as much as I love the homeland, there really is some gorgeous countryside here on the continent. Naruto replied as he leaned up against a withering old oak tree. Azula nodded while still staring out at the valley. Naruto, however, had turned his attention to her. He stared at the girl in silence for some time. She hadn't handled the execution of Yaorin in the way he had expected. He hadn't really thought she would just blow past such a thing with no problem. He wasn't like Ozai or his own father that thought Azula was devoid of such things as sympathy and guilt. He knew the girl hidden behind the veneer of the cold calculating princess was incredibly vulnerable to pressure from the outside and extremely fragile to certain things. It sounds cliché, but it might help to talk to someone about how you feel, Azula. He said softly. What do you mean? She asked, playing at ignorance. We might not see each other as much as we would like or really at all while I'm here on campaign, but I know you better than anyone else does. Better than even Tai Li. He said while pushing off the tree he was leaning against to coma and wrapped the girl up in his arms. She fought against the instinct initially, but soon melted into his embrace. The princess remained silent as she let him hold her though. I won't make you talk about it, but you'll be leaving for home soon, so I want you to try before then. He said before pressing his lips to the crown of her head, causing her to wrap her own arms around him. Thank you. Not that I really need all this, she began to say in a haughty voice before her arms tightened around him and she stopped talking. He had started to pull away when she said that, but clearly she felt a bit differently than she was implying. Azula, it might not mean much, however I will say you did nothing wrong. You were well within your rights to kill Yaorin the way you did. You don't have to feel guilty for that, he said before frowning as she pulled away. You can rest easy. I don't feel guilty. It would be unfitting. I'm going to go see if there is something to eat. Azula said before turning and heading back into the small base and leaving Naruto to sigh in exasperation. Over the next few days Azula still hadn't opened up about her feelings regarding the execution, but Naruto hadn't pressured her either. Instead he had wisely taken his opportunity to enjoy some time with his princess before they both had to return to their normal lives. She seemed of the same mind. The two of them sparred a couple times, lightly given that his condition was still not back to what it should be. The soldiers were awed by the displays of their leaders in action. As if they weren't completely enthralled by both Naruto and Azula by this point. It couldn't last forever, sadly. Eventually Azula and her entourage had to return to the capital and the scrutiny of the Fire Lord. Even though Azula agreed with Naruto that her father knew where she was and what she was doing at all times. The small send-off was a warm affair. Rumors ran rampant throughout the brigade and beyond when Azula stole a kiss from her cousin as she climbed into the steam cart and left. His closest sub-commanders all had teasing looks on their faces after witnessing the act, though Mulan seemed a bit more reserved regarding what had happened. With the departure of Azula and her group, however, Naruto turned his full attention to getting his forces into fighting shape. Raiko would be returning soon and with him hopefully a new order to advance. The captain wanted his troops prepared for that. They were probably going to be on the front lines after all. It had taken some time to return to the palace, and over that time Azula had made it clear to her friends that she wasn't interested in discussing her feelings on the matter of Yoren's demise. Unfortunately, while Tai Li and the other girls respected that, they did not respect her wishes to not discuss her growing affection for Naruto. That parting peck on his lips had sent all of her friends into a frenzy as they grilled her about every little facet of her attraction toward him. She had briefly thought that Chell would come to her rescue when she had told the others it was nothing more than an innocent goodbye. Instead, she had taken the chance to taunt Azula and tell her that Naruto was more interested in her far more developed assets than Azula's still growing ones. Ty Lee and Mai had wisely remained out of range of the ensuing dispute between firebenders as Chell continued to poke and prod and taunt the princess. Of course, none of them mentioned that doing so had completely taken Azula's mind off of her decisions and feelings regarding Yoren's case. Sadly, now that they were actually back in the capital, standing outside the throne room doors and awaiting the attendant to announce them, the playful and happy mood that they had managed to create was quickly fading as the aura of death and dominance that Fire Lord Ozai had worked to put into place overwhelmed any other feelings within his wing of the palace. Azula, do you want us to come in with you? Ty Lee offered. The girl was clearly not looking forward to being in the presence of a dissatisfied Fire Lord, but for Azula she would brave it and more without flinching. I'll be fine. He's my father, Ty Lee, it will be fine. Azula said. She truly didn't have the same fear the others did. Then again, in the years following his dismissal of Zuko, she had felt much less certain of her safety in court as his daughter. The Fire Lord will admit you now, Princess, the guard said as he approached. Very good. Wait here, girls, I shouldn't be long, she hoped. Following the guard, she slipped between the two oversized doors into a dimly lit cavernous hall. Banners hung from pillars that kept the high ceiling up, and at the far end of the long room a dais sat behind a roaring line of fire. Upon that dais, illuminated by yet more serpentine lines of flame, sat the Fire Lord. He appeared as distant and calm as always. Usually Azula took a bit of comfort in that. It had allowed her to dream up what might lay behind the mask for the cold man that was her father. Imagine reasons for all the things she secretly disliked. As she grew, that ability to pretend seemed to slip away from her, and she was trapped with the reality of the man before her. She made way forward before bowing deeply, tucking her knees beneath her and pressing her forehead to the floor. In this setting and scenario, it was the only fitting etiquette. Azula, I see you have returned unspoiled by your little adventure to the front lines. The Fire Lord's voice called out in thick, measured, and controlled fashion. I have, Father, she replied simply and without emotion, though she did ensure she spoke with utmost clarity and confidence. Ozai would accept nothing less of his heir. And how is the war progressing? Up to your standards? He asked, purposefully dancing about the topic she was summoned to speak on. He toyed with the conversation as a saber-toothed Musalian would with its food. It seems slow going, but I know our officers and soldiers are striving for success across the continent. They have faced many setbacks but continue to work toward the ultimate victory. She replied calmly. Such wonderful news my heir brings me. Perhaps that is why you and not a messenger could have brought such knowledge to me. Perhaps you had other reasons to go gallivanting to the front without my express permission. He asked with a mocking tone. Derision was the only real sound in his raspy voice. I felt it was important to check on the specialized unit that was recently created. After all, its success is important to our nation's future, and as your heir, that means it is important to me. Azula said clearly. I'm certain the fact that your uncle's child leads the mixed unit had nothing to do with your brash actions. Just as the mistreatment of the unit by Yaorin was handled as it normally would be. Ozai said, already growing bored of the games that he instigated. You seem very well informed of a matter beneath your notice, Father. Azula said. You would be surprised of the things I am very well informed of, daughter. Like the fact that my brother's son should be in the process of moving his troops forward in the lines as we speak. Ozai said flatly, taunting her with the knowledge that Naruto and his forces were not fit for heavy combat but were being sent anyway. Was it because she had kissed him? Was this punishment for that? They were heavily affected by Yoren's campaign to weaken and discredit them. This could be sending them into wholesale slaughter. She commented, keeping her voice even as best as she could. Soldiers die, Azula. It is a war after all, it's inevitable that some of them perish. Perhaps it is better for you to mind where your affections are placed in the future. It is unjust of a princess to distract a lowly soldier from his duty by teasing him with the impossibility of her hand. Ozai let the smallest amount of glee at the pained silence he received from his daughter waft over him before he shifted it to a farcical impression of a fatherly smile. Your handling of the upstart Major Yaorin was impeccable. I especially enjoyed the homage to my own handling of your disappointing brother. Well done, Azula, Ozai praised. Unlike normal, though Azula didn't preen at his words. Soon you will show our people and the world why it is that you are my only true heir. The time for you to make a debut onto the field is coming, prepare your followers to aid you in that endeavor. I also will begin bringing possible matches for you to the palace to inspect. You will need to make an heir of your own eventually. The Fire Lord stated, turning his attention to thoughts on what marriage would prove most useful to him. By your leave, father. Azula said, getting a simple wave to leave in return. The princess stood and turned and made her way from the room, carefully keeping her demeanor in check as she slipped between the massive doors and right past her group. The girls exchanged looks. Ty Lee started after her but was stopped by Chell. Let her have a moment alone. Whatever the Fire Lord said clearly upset her. She advised. Even more reason she shouldn't be left alone. Ty Lee said as she shook free of the older woman's grip and took off after the princess. Ty Lee followed her friend to her wing of the palace. Azula had sped up her pace to a point that unless Ty Lee actually ran she wouldn't catch up to her. Instead she kept pace and followed after Azula as the princess stormed past guards and servants, ignored lords and dignitaries, and passed through the entire palace all the way to her private quarters. She caught up to Azula just as she slammed open her door. The princess set about tearing off the ornate clothing used for meeting with the Fire Lord in an official capacity as she just had. Literally tearing it off of her body, not caring for the damage done to the incredibly expensive garments. Azula, Ty Lee cautiously mumbled as she followed her deeper into the house-sized bedroom. The princess ignored her as she finally got down to her undergarments and began quickly pulling on her preferred clothing. Simple and form-fitting. Expensive material no doubt, but not gaudy and ornate like most would expect of a princess. Azula. Ty Lee tried again. It's fine, just more of my father's games. You know how he is. He enjoys seeing me react to threats towards Naruto or you or Mai. He knows it bothers me and thinks the more he threatens it the more I will pull away from you all. So I'll be more like him. It's just his games, she said as she laced up her clothing with rough jerking motions. If you believed that you wouldn't be so upset. Ty Lee said before stepping forward and smoothly moving Azula's hands out of the way and lacing her outfit up for her. Maybe. Azula quietly replied as she stared out the large doors to her balcony. That isn't all that is bothering you. You know that whatever he says about Naruto he will never directly threaten him. It looks bad if he harms his family. I've heard after he did what he did to Zuko some whispered the name of the mad dragon behind his back. Ty Lee said. Azula listened. When Ty Lee let her playful and carefree nature drop, it was time to take her seriously and hear what she had to say. Azula had learned that well over the years, and with Ty Lee having a knack for going unnoticed as just another noble girl at court, she had so very much to say to those she was willing to chat with. What did he say about Naruto anyway? Ty Lee asked as she turned her attention from helping Azula with her clothes to undoing the princess's hair and brushing out any knots. Naruto and his company will be heading to the front line, as we speak, he said. Azula muttered. That is what is bothering you? Ty Lee asked a bit incredulously. You saw them when we left. They are in no condition to lead the advance. Azula replied hotly. I would have thought by now you knew he can take care of himself. If he needs help, he'll ask for it like he did with Yaorin. Besides, you knew it would happen eventually. The mixed company is too useful not to use it. You told me all about it on the way there and on the way back. Ty Lee said as she continued to brush Azula's hair. That's not the problem, Ty Lee. He said it was because of me. Because I kissed Naruto to say goodbye and in front of all those soldiers. Word about it beat us back to the palace and he just thought it would be a good lesson in what I can and cannot do as princess. What do you mean? I will be entertaining suitors for the next year, at least. Azula growled. Oh. Well, I'm sure not even the Fire Lord can force you into a marriage if you challenge them all to a duel. Azula. Ty Lee joked weakly, trying to lighten the mood. Don't give me any ideas. She grumbled while crossing her arms over her chest. Ty Lee continued in silence for some time. She could practically feel the stress and anxiety still wafting off of Azula in waves. It felt wrong for the normally cool and controlled princess. It was far worse now, after her meeting with the Fire Lord, but it had started before they had ever left the continent. They were discussing rough topics already, best to take care of all the baggage if she could. You don't let things hang over you this long normally. Ty Lee said as she slowed down a bit in her brushing. What? I just met with him. What do you mean? Azula asked. I don't mean about Naruto and the mixed company or about the suitors. That was all just the last straw, I think. I think you are bothered about something that happened when you handled the major. You're letting it bother you when normally you would just attack it head on and deal with it. Ty Lee explained. Azula clenched her fists and blew out a hot breath of air. I am growing incredibly tired of you and even Chell bringing up that. It happened, I handled it, it's over. I don't understand why you keep bringing it up to me. Because Naruto asked us to. Ty Lee easily answered. He what? Azula demanded, turning to face her best friend. He didn't need to. I would have asked about it either way and kept pestering you until you gave in and spilled what happened specifically to make you so upset. Azula stared at the girl for a moment before rolling her eyes. Ty Lee had a very simplistic mindset, but that also meant she could have a very determined mindset. There would be no shaking the lithe girl off of the topic now. I would have handled it by now if I knew why I was so bothered, okay. Can we drop it at that? She asked, already knowing the answer. Most definitely not. We need to get to the bottom of this. I like your aura the way it normally is. It's gorgeous like that. Right now it's almost as gross as your father's. Ty Lee said. Azula puffed out another annoyed breath but gave in. She had a soft spot for Ty Lee and they both knew that Ty Lee would happily abuse it to help Azula in the end. Tell me about your feelings. Whatever you can anyway. Ty Lee said as she pushed Azula back into a position to begin brushing her hair again. Azula thought back to the moment and struggled to put the emotions she felt into words very well. She knew she felt differently than she expected to, but not in the way she thought that she might. She didn't have the flood of guilt that she imagined most normal people felt with the man's death at her hands. She didn't feel the joy or pleasure she imagined her father would want her to feel either. She wanted to lie to herself and say she felt nothing, but that wasn't the case. The truth of the matter was, that in the last moment she felt confused. Confused because she knew others expected more from such an act. She thought she would either be disgusted or overjoyed by the act. Honestly, it was neither. The act itself was nothing. A task. One she admittedly didn't enjoy, which she imagined would have annoyed her father. There was no grand ideal, there wasn't a dramatic reason like honor or anything like that. Yaorin had wronged Naruto and was a danger to someone she cared about. That he should die was obvious. To part of her. Another part said it was too much. Her father's pleasure felt like ash in her mouth. She had been practically trained to think of killing as a simple task and it was, but she knew that wasn't what he or her mother or even Naruto and her friends thought of an execution as. That needling little voice in her head that sounded oh so very much like her mother mocked her again about becoming a monster, her father's little pet monster. Her father, that mocked her subtly and did his best to wean her of any relationship besides the one she had with him. Azula? Ty Lee asked, bringing Azula out of her darkening and maddening thoughts. Yes. You were going to tell me your feelings. Like why you are so much more on edge. even after getting to spend so much time with Naruto recently. She said. Azula could almost feel how the different answers to that question would play out. For now she wanted to delay even more. She had to, because truthfully she didn't want to answer it yet. I haven't decided. Ask me again later. Azula snapped entirely, despite all her determination, realized that she really couldn't get anything more about it from the other girl. She couldn't force her to open up after all. Only time would tell if she could come out with it. Slabs of stone rocketed past overhead as Naruto marched his force into position. They had a couple supporting units for this battle, but it was already going poorly. At least it was going just as poorly for their enemies. The hilly terrain and thick forests made proper formations and communication practically impossible. Still, the two sides fought it out like there was no tomorrow. Ready the line. He bellowed out and the company obeyed. Exhausted, still hungry, and weaker than he was comfortable with, but they still obeyed. Prepare enemy charge. He shouted as he saw the glints of sunlight against metal as the Earth Kingdom infantry rushed toward them through the trees. Wall prep. Mulan barked, getting the Earth Benders in their force to step forward and ready to create sudden defenses to keep the enemy at bay. That was one thing that he could thank Yaorin for. Since they had been kept out of the fighting for so long, word had spread across the Earth Kingdom army that it had been confusion and propaganda that Earth and Water Benders were fighting for the Fire Nation. After today they would have a harder time denying the mixed company's existence. Still, he would have preferred to at least have Reiko back in command before he and his troops were put into combat once again. Naruto glared down at the map spread across the stump he had been using as a table within his command tent. Those before him displayed the region surrounding Fort Mekong. The installation was proving to be aptly named. Harem Mekong had been an Earth Kingdom noble and general that had led the enemy across the northern fronts for roughly 30 consecutive years after the war began. She had almost single-handedly united the Earth Kingdom nobles of the region into a formidable force that beat back the Fire Nation military time and again. Her namesake had been doing the same for the last year. That was why Naruto and his men had been brought in. Ostensibly, Naruto suspected that it was yet another attempt to push his forces and himself to their breaking point. After all, the now Colonel Naruto and his soldiers were suddenly in high demand in every front all the time. The longest period of recuperation his men had received was a total of 2 months, and that was nearly 8 months ago. The longest they'd had since then was 9 days between the success of their last operation and receiving orders to march as quickly as possible to relieve the force attempting to besiege Fort Mekong. Colonel, another messenger from General Reiko reported in this morning. He says what resources the general can spare will be accompanying the next band of reinforcements sent our way. A young private reported to him as he stepped into the tent. Naruto saluted and dismissed him. It was a new experience having soldiers under his command that were actually younger than him. The private was 16 or 17 and Naruto had just recently turned 18. It made Naruto cringe slightly. Replacement troopers simply meant that he'd suffered casualties. He knew no unit avoided them entirely, but his had become rather common. Luckily, the majority of casualties were wounded rather than dead, and that was almost entirely thanks to the combined bending style of his force. It was no longer a mere company. Staring down at the maps, he took measure of the forces completely under his command. The largest group was the 29th Infantry. They hadn't earned a moniker yet, though he expected that to change in time, yet the infantry battalion was beyond dedicated. Colonials trying to prove their value to the nation. All of his soldiers were like-minded in that regard. His force, roughly 1,500 strong, was filled with the 29th who wanted to prove they stood on par with those born on the Isles. His original command in the mixed company, led now by Major Mulan, still had a chip on their shoulder towards the majority of military command, and his two newest units were composed of Earth Benders and Water Benders respectively. They all had something to prove. Just like he did. Though his was more a statement directly to the Fire Lord. Something along the lines of, still breathing. Short and noteworthy. Something that he knew pissed the old man off by now. Sergeant, what is the disposition of our units on the northern approach? Naruto asked one of his men nearby. No change, Colonel. The enemy is keeping them from successfully advancing up the ridge to the walls by creating pitfalls and sudden changes in elevation. Their benders are too entrenched to locate and specifically target as well. The man replied. Naruto nodded his head. He hadn't expected much difference. At least he could rely on them keeping up a slow advance to keep the enemy occupied. Mulan had both the mixed company and the infantry working toward that goal. All the while the 3rd Siege Squadron, his new unit of earthbenders, were keeping the enemy benders from simply filling the trenches and burying Naruto's men alive. With all of these forces engaged, it left only one unit under his command available. The newly promoted Lieutenant Kita, the only waterbender of officer rank in the whole of the Fire Nation military, stepped into the tent and nodded toward him. Naruto did his best to ignore the modified uniform that Kita and several of her waterbenders had adopted. It was incredibly revealing, to the point Chell would have approved. Is it done? He asked her. Exactly as planned, Colonel. She happily reported. Good. Sergeant, send word to the Major and the unit captains. We will begin the operation, await the signal. Naruto barked as he began moving toward his lieutenant. Confirmed, Colonel. Operation is underway, units are to await the go signal. The sergeant repeated back before taking off to give the orders to the various officers under Naruto's command. Lead the way, Kita, Naruto said as he followed after her. She bobbed her head and took off at a brisk pace through the ramshackle command trench that they had built roughly 2 weeks ago. It didn't take long before they were circling around out of the defenses and up a small deer trail in the steep hillsides and cliffs surrounding Fort Mekong. As they climbed up the concealed slope, Naruto could see a better view of the battle below. Fort Mekong was constructed in such a way that it had several defensive tiers arrayed along the rise of a steep set of slopes with one side facing a sheer cliff. It forced attackers to advance up the steep slopes directly under fire and attack from Earth Kingdom soldiers. It was an excellent defensive position. Currently all 3 approaches had portions of Naruto's forces applying pressure. Occasionally a small team would charge a ways up under the protection of water and earth benders before letting loose a series of large balloons filled with a tar-like oil that splattered and covered the fort's walls when thrown. His firebenders then went to work torching it and created massive pillars of smoke and flame to try and cover an advance. Sadly, the defenders had gotten wise after his forces had seized 3 of the tiers of the fort's defenses. The easiest tiers that had little if any incline between their walls. Now they were able to smother the flames and disperse the smoke before his troops could make a proper advance toward the walls, and they were continuously beaten back. This had better work, Naruto mumbled to himself as he watched a pair of his soldiers be crushed by a boulder slung around by an enemy earthbender. It will. You planned it yourself, so have some faith in your plans, Colonel. They haven't led us wrong yet, Kita said cheerfully. Naruto merely nodded in response. They had arrived at their destination after all. On the far side of Fort Mekong was a narrow river valley, a perfect place to stage a force for further advancement into the northern provinces of the Earth Kingdom. Unfortunately, the fort kept any sort of deployment there from happening. That of course meant it had to be taken, but it really was seemingly impenetrable. A miniaturized Ba Sing Se. However, Naruto had noticed that pretty much all of the defenses of the fort were geared toward the 3 sensible approaches. The 4th was an impassable cliff face after all. Except for a few details. Kita's squad of roughly a half-dozen water benders all saluted Naruto crisply as he approached. They looked quite proud of themselves, and for good reason. They stood on either side of a small grate carved into the mountain itself. Not metal, otherwise firebenders would have melted it long ago one way or another. No, the bars were carved out of stone itself, but with enough time and pressure water can cut away stone with relative ease. Kita had been the one to show him it was possible in a previous operation. He was simply applying that to a new plan. The pipe is small, sir. A soldier with their equipment would never fit inside. Kita reported. But a bender stripped to just the necessities, he said. A bit of creative water bending and we can all slither right up the pipe. Kita grinned. Excellent. Just tell me it isn't a sewage pipe. Thankfully not, it's an overflow for the fort's fresh water collection. They have a natural spring somewhere in there that provides fresh clean water, but it provides so much that they can't use it all. Well, normally, they are using a lot of water to put out the fires our friends out front are starting. Kita explained as she and the others all began stripping down to even less coverings than what they were initially wearing. Naruto began to follow suit, causing them all to pause. What? He asked as they all stared at him. Nothing, sir. The troopers replied before hurrying to finish what they were doing. Naruto chose to ignore the lingering eyes of Kita though. The woman and Mulan had practically made themselves his personal bodyguards since they realized the Fire Lord was doing his best to get Naruto killed in battle. She didn't approve of him joining them on this task, but she couldn't exactly argue it with him either. Not in front of the troops. Let's get moving. The longer we take, the longer the others are smashing their faces into the Earth Kingdom defenses. He said as he motioned for one of the water benders to take point. Yes, sir. They chorused before the squad joined him and all of them slipped into the tight space of the drainage pipe. It was cramped, warm, and humid. Not to mention the rough stone cut and scraped at them as they shimmied up its length. To make matters worse, the pipe steeply rose up after a short distance, and with no real handholds to climb they largely scaled the pipe by pushing their backs against the opposite side as they climbed up with their arms and legs. Exhausting didn't come close to properly describing the task. Naruto and his troops pushed on though, and eventually the tube began to change angle again until they reached the end of it. Colonel, I can see the fort's water reservoir. It's about 6 meters below us. I can't tell how deep it is though. The man ahead of him reported. Good. Try to lower yourself down and keep straight when you drop into the water. I doubt they will hear us down here, but it's best to keep as quiet as we can. Naruto said as he readjusted his grip on the slick rock surrounding him. The water bender did as ordered and slowly lowered himself as far as he could before releasing and dropping down into the water below with a splash. Naruto had shifted to the mouth of the overflow pipe and watched for any sign of the defenders checking things out. Luckily there didn't seem to be any suspicion of their forces entering the fortress this way. One by one the team slipped into the reservoir of water below. It was more like an underground lake, deep enough that Naruto wondered just how deep into the mountain if extended. Not that it mattered. Besieging the fort was obviously more of a futile gesture than initially thought. There is a locked grate on the door. The only other ways out are the wells, Kita pointed out to him, pulling his eyes up to the ceiling where several narrow holes with chains or the occasional rope hung down. One or two even had buckets deeply sunk into the water. We can cut through the door like we did with the grate at the base of the mountain, but it will take time. Not as long though. This one is a lot thinner. One of the benders commented. Meant to keep saboteurs or something maybe. Another pondered. Army regulations don't need to make sense. We have the same. Another snorted before sinking slightly in the water as they remembered they were in the presence of Kita and Naruto. Hey, sounds about right. Deal with it as quickly as you can. Can any of the rest of you move up through the wells up there? Naruto asked. The water benders all looked up at the ceiling a bit warily. The chains and ropes were far too thin to hold someone's body weight, but the wells were just wide enough for them to perhaps move through side by side in pairs. It's pretty narrow, sir. We would need a lot of force with the water and we could end up slamming into the stone of the cavern ceiling. A sergeant said with a frown. The others should be able to make quick work of the lock. I can head up that well there if you wish to take another, Colonel. Kita said with completely confidence in her accuracy at essentially launching herself at a hole in the stone face. Naruto stared at her for a moment, trying to weigh out whether or not it was simply to try and make it easier for him. The dark-skinned woman grinned at him after a moment, and realizing his staring could be taken another way, he cleared his throat and rapidly nodded his head. That's what we'll do then, he said, and the water benders got to work. He floated on the water watching them for a moment. The door to the reservoir was on a raised stone platform where the waterbenders all now huddled together as they worked together to pump water up for two of their comrades to funnel into high-pressure blasts to slowly cut through the stone. Coupled with the earlier climb, as well as the upcoming fighting, the squad would definitely be earning some rest. He just hoped he could actually give them some before they got new marching orders again. "We'll go up when they are halfway through," he said. "I'm ready when you are, Colonel," Kita said before grinning as she made a point to stretch in front of her commanding officer, showing off that, like Naruto, she had been maturing during her time in the military. "Spirits save me from the women under my command," he quietly murmured as he recalled Mulan making a point of doing similar things over the last year. "Colonel, we've passed the halfway point," one of his troopers announced. "Good. See you up there, everyone," he commented, making a brief glance at them to check the multitude of knives and water bags strapped across their forms. That must have made the climb all that much worse. Still, they had completed it all the same. "Kita," he said, turning to her. "Here I go," she replied before twisting briefly in a painful-looking manner before rocketing upward on a pillar of water straight up toward the opening above her. His propulsion took a little longer as he had to bend jets of flame from his hands to clear the water before he added his feet to it and took off at dizzying speeds up another well. Briefly his mind conjured the image of some sort of greater lid settled over the top of his exit that would kill him in the most humiliating way possible if it was blocking his path. Luckily he instead emerged in the middle of a small courtyard surrounded by stout buildings and shocked Earth Kingdom forces. With a spin, the gouts of flame propelling him upward changed shape and became deadly lances of fire as they shot out toward the multitude of targets around him. Mulan grimaced as another boulder smashed into the defenses her forces were temporarily taking refuge behind. Shards of stone fragmented and peppered the troops with tiny splinters that caused the men to hiss and curse in pain. They didn't leave cover though, and thankfully none were severely injured from that attack. Casualties were mounting gradually as the retaliatory attacks from the fort's defenders kept Mulan from making any proper push for the next line of defenses. That was expected though. They were as far up the mountain as the colonel had expected to get without major reinforcements or some sort of new weaponry to turn the tide. Again, this was fine. Fort Mekong would never fall to anything short of completely overwhelming numbers or something completely unexpected. As she saw the first bursts of flame and plumes of smoke begin rising from the crest of the mountain, she knew that the unexpected was being pulled off at that very moment. "Lieutenant Xian," she roared, calling up one of her subordinates. "Ma'am." A young lieutenant, probably a year or two older than herself truthfully, responded, making sure not to salute. Some of the earthbenders had already proven incredibly skilled with sharp eyes and precise bending of small stones. As had their archers. "Send word to the siege squad and the few pieces of artillery we have. They are to target the next 2 tiers of the fort with everything they have," she commanded. "Orders received. Artillery and siege squadron to target next 2 tiers with everything they have," he repeated before selecting a handful of men to act as runners. The siege and artillery teams were spread all along the 3 approaches to the fort, so they had to deliver the message to multiple officers to actually respond properly. Hopefully this new pressure would keep the enemy busy while Naruto and Kita handled the inside of the fort. Mulan herself intended to seize the next tier right now though. "Xian, signal assault," Mulan barked. Xian nodded and immediately began propelling a set of flames in a specific pattern into the sky, which was soon copied all along the line. Telling troops to charge the enemy was far easier to simply signal with a burst of flame than specific targets for ranged attack after all. Mulan herself drew her sword and jumped over the barrier shielding her and her men. She didn't bother looking back to see if they followed after her. She could tell by the sudden crescendo in men and women letting out war cries that the charge was beginning. Naruto had cleared the first courtyard with a rapid intensity that had made sure nothing could properly respond to his sudden assault. Charred remains and smoldering corpses were all that remained of the garrison in that part of the fort. By now though the enemy had figured out that the Fire Nation had somehow gotten forces within their walls. Naruto slid on his knees across the now muddy ground to avoid a trio of spears being thrust into the space his abdomen had previously possessed. He didn't need to bother attacking the spearmen in retaliation though, as Kita separated their heads from their shoulders with the sudden strike from a razor-thin blade of ice. He took just a moment to watch as the blade reformed into its liquid state before blasting another man hard enough in the face to knock him onto the ground and force its way into his mouth and nose and even his eye sockets as it pulverized the soft tissue inside them. The moment passed in a flash and he was back on his feet, forming a blast of fire that he hurled down a corridor within a section of the fort's innermost walls. Terrified screams told him he had chosen a good target, and so he poured on a little extra flame to engulf the entire hallway and make sure those inside were dealt with. By the time he had dealt with them, the rest of the waterbender squad had rejoined him and Kita and the keep of Fort Mekong had fallen. Now they just needed to enact part 2 of his plan. Drown them, he commanded, and Kita and her team immediately set to work bending a good portion of the water inside the reservoir up the stairs the team had used before forcing it out the main gate of the fortress keep. It wasn't near enough water to literally drown the entire force of defenders. It was more than enough to create a sudden mudslide though, right into the main body of defenders who were right in its path. The best the earthbenders could hope to do would be to slow it down, and with attackers advancing from the outside now and Naruto happily following after the wave of viscous muck hurtling down the slope, the defenders were truly feeling the pressure now. Pushing himself up in the air and willingly making himself a target, Naruto shot up above the defenders in clear view of both the defenders and his own army. A loud roar of approval from the advancing forces of the Fire Nation welcomed him, along with a flurry of arrows and stones from the Earth Kingdom forces, nothing well aimed though, so he easily dodged around and avoided the attacks. He smiled as he saw the tiers of the formidable Fort Mekong falter and surrender under his troops. His waterbenders sowed chaos among the bulk of the defenders and kept them from supporting their brothers in arms, and his main force streamed over the defenses like a ravenous colony of ants. His mood quickly began to sour though. The battle wasn't even over yet, but he could already pick out the messengers from high command cresting a hill near his base camp. New marching orders were already being delivered. Naruto made the rounds at the victory celebration to show his support for his men. He hadn't even had time to properly clean himself up, and so he was still covered in soot, mud, and more than a little baked on blood. If anything, it seemed to thrill his men to know he had been in the middle of the battle with all of them. He wished he could enjoy the victory just as they were. Instead, his mind was solidly wrapped up on the rows of boxes lined up alongside one of the captured walls. The numbers weren't crippling for his force, but they were always more than he was comfortable with. Nothing shook his belief in their cause quite like that sight. It also made him wonder how many rows just like it had been formed over the last century. How many more would be formed before the war was over? Would they win before they ran out of men to lay into boxes like that? He kept all his thoughts regarding such things locked carefully behind a smiling but tired face as he walked among his men. That and the very potent rage bubbling in his chest at the new orders to begin marching south once more after capturing the fort. How the hell that bastard Ozai knew to send his messengers when they were just finishing up their operation was anyone's guess. Even if the orders nowhere stated the Fire Lord, simply the orders of the command staff, he knew they came from the man himself. You're slipping. The men will notice if you aren't careful. Mulan's voice suddenly slipped into his ear, causing his forced smile to become a bit more believable. I want to head back to my tent. We all need to rest, and the reserves have the prisoners in hand already. Naruto said as he began heading toward the command area where he, Mulan, and Kita had all shared a large tent. Technically Kita's entire squad slept there too, but rumors circulated either way. We can't yet. The messengers came with reinforcements. Kita reminded him. He clicked his teeth together but nodded before leading his small entourage of officers toward the gathered replacements nearby. He was surprised by the numbers, more than enough to replace his losses as well as a whole additional battalion of infantry, like the first drawn from the colonies. Despite their numbers though, he was rather unhappy to see the new soldiers were all woefully young and untrained. Not one was older than Mulan and most were younger than himself still. A few approached the age he had started his career at. Unlike him, they were not trained like he had been. At least not to the same extent. 2,000 soldiers and nearly 700 of them were green recruits. Outwardly he welcomed them all warmly. They needed the numbers, but the time he would need to bring them all up to snuff was clearly not present, as his orders were to leave Mekong in the hands of the reserves and immediately march south to reunite with Reiko for a new series of advances. The men collectively grumbled about having to move out so soon, though it was a bit telling that the green new bloods seemed more annoyed than those that had just won a major battle. They were surely tired of marching for weeks on end, and they lacked the knowledge of their situation that the more veteran soldiers had gradually come to accept as the norm. Mulan, make sure the junior officers have their new guys paired up with more experienced ones, and I want extra breaks as we march. It will add some time to the march, but we can at least get some basic drilling into their heads before they embarrass me in front of the general. Naruto gruffly said as he ran a cold washcloth along his face to try and clear some of the grime off. Mulan smirked at the thought before nodding and heading off to pass out his orders. Naruto let her go as he waved for Kita to do her thing. The white-haired beauty was far too happy to oblige him and bend a current of water down over his head to help him quickly clean off the disgusting leftovers of a hard-fought battle. Just as he expected, their trip back south was taking time. He had sent a message ahead of them to Reiko to explain the situation, and as he had expected, the general had been accommodating. He even sent a few small units of veteran troops back with his reply to help whip Naruto's new bloods into shape. They would need the men to be as ready as they could be. Reiko had been trying to get Naruto back under his command for a while. He was building up a force for another push toward Omashu. With the new status he wielded as a general, the hope was that they might actually get within distance of the legendary city to besiege it. As long as they could keep from getting hamstrung by their own leadership once again. Tonight the force was resting in the ruins of Kadaoshi. Prior to the war it was already largely depopulated, but the first 20 years had seen the populace displaced and the majority of the city pulverized in combat. It was a big loss for the Earth Kingdom at the time. Kadaoshi had a huge temple complex that the city had sprung up around. Both were long abandoned by now though, and little if anything remained of the once beautiful temple and city. At least the ruins provided some shelter for the army, as it had decided to drizzle a small light rain that evening as they made camp. Naruto had selected the inner sanctum of the old temple. It was a large open area that had once been filled with statues and had murals painted on the walls. Whatever images had decorated those walls had long been overtaken by the overgrowth and buildup of grime from a near century of disrepair and lack of maintenance. A handful of the statues were partially intact though. Figures dressed in traditional garb from all four of the nations stood in a row against the back wall. It looked to Naruto that some sort of artillery had torn a large hole in the ceiling before smashing the majority of objects in the room. Those further back against the rear wall had been spared though, and even had a small section of roof still standing over them. He'd assembled his tent in such a way as to use the wall and remains of the roof here as his personal quarters. Or at least he would have if Mulan hadn't simply begun constructing her own tent tarp in a similar manner and connecting it to his own to make it a double-length shelter. He of course said nothing about it. The major had been sticking close by his side ever since that business with Yaorin, which felt like a lifetime ago some days. I'll start on a cooking fire, Colonel. Do you want rice or potatoes? She asked him. We have potatoes. He turned to her. Some of the homes in the city had overgrown gardens. The vegetables have outgrown their plots of land and most of the locals seem to grow a lot of potatoes. She answered simply. Ah. Then potatoes do sound pretty good. We've eaten bland rice for months now. He groused. Forgive me, I'll endeavor to make it more flavorful from here on. Mulan replied demurely. What? No, that's not what I meant. Your sense of humor is starting to grate on my nerves, Major. He said with a sigh as he saw her grin when he thought he had insulted her. I will go get started on cooking a meal then, she said with a more prominent smile, knowing that he didn't really mean it. They had grown ever closer as of late. Mulan was making her intentions known to him, and while he wasn't against such a thing, he couldn't help that his thoughts drifted back to Azula more often than not. While he and Mulan had grown closer, Azula and he had slowly communicated less and less. Part of it was no doubt the increase in their responsibilities. He felt as though he spent more time marching and inspecting his troops than he did breathing. She too was being bombarded with tasks in her role as the crown princess. Worse, however, was the looming fact that Azula was being made to entertain suitors on a regular, sometimes daily basis. In her last letter, she had even mentioned her father's growing agitation with the fact that she had taken to dueling any that she couldn't find a way to dismiss for other reasons. Half of the men sent her way were nearly her father's age as well. Unfortunately, despite both of them clearly detesting the situation, Azula had sent him a letter a few months detailing their situation so that they were both on the same page. It had unfortunately concluded with her proclaiming the dream that they might have had to one day be a couple was dead. He'd nearly burnt the letter when he'd seen the personal seal of both Azula and the Fire Lord stamped upon the paper. Still, Naruto had known this would happen in the long run. He knew the moment that the two of them had shared a kiss that word would get back to the Fire Lord, and not only would Ozai do all he could to separate the two permanently, he would also be sending Naruto's force into the worst fighting that he could find. At least it promised quick promotions for himself and his men. Ozai couldn't just have him outright killed either. Naruto was practically a household name by now. Even the Fire Lord would face repercussions for simply murdering a hero of the nation. It made Naruto a perfect candidate to martyr on a desperate campaign for the homeland, though. His thoughts continued to circulate around dour subjects as he changed into a more comfortable set of underclothes and he settled into a place on a dusty stone bench between two towering 8-foot statues. Mulan joined him before long, and after handing him a bowl of stewed potatoes and rabbit, she leaned against his side much closer than a commander and his subordinate should be. Not that he would ever imagine reprimanding her for it. Having the familiar weight of her body pressed against his side was comforting, especially as they enjoyed a meal together in the cool air of the evening. He knew she wanted more, but he couldn't take that step yet. Her head on his shoulder was as far as he could take himself yet, otherwise he felt it was unfair to both Mulan and Azula as his mind still circled around thoughts of the latter. That wasn't truly fair to any involved though. There was no happiness there, and he had made it clear to Azula that no matter what, she had his support. Support. He had to go elsewhere for something more than that, and it wasn't far. Mulan, he began. The older girl leaned back up and turned to face him with full attention. He could tell with the way her eyes were locked onto his own that she had a pretty good idea with what he was struggling with right this moment. You've been by my side since I joined the army. Every step of the way. You're an amazing soldier and commander and a better comrade. Honestly, I couldn't imagine trying to do any of this without you. He let the words spill out, not trying to control them, just letting them express what he was feeling as best as he could. At least until he was interrupted. All around them the statues began to glow a bright bluish-white color, and panic began rising through the ranks of the soldiers outside as the temple seemed to light up with ethereal energy. Naruto and Mulan quickly backed away from the statues and stared in shock at the sight before Naruto realized what was happening. Every nation had temples and shrines dedicated to the Avatar. Even the Fire Nation venerated the bridge between the physical and spiritual world. This was no doubt one of the Earth Kingdom's temples dedicated to the Avatar. That it was activating in such a way meant only one thing. What is this? Mulan asked as the light began to fade. The Avatar has returned. This war just entered a new chapter. Naruto said grimly. There was no way the Fire Lord could simply ignore this. Things were going to become interesting to say the least.